Beatrice Crowell didn't even look at Evelyn when she said it. She looked at Gideon. You hired her? The word landed like a slap. A vagrant with a litter of children she can barely feed? Gideon, people are talking. Evelyn stood 3 feet away, holding her youngest against her hip, close enough to hear every syllable. Beatrice knew that. That was the point. And Evelyn had 32 cents to her name and nowhere left to go. If you've ever been looked through, like you weren't standing right there, like your presence was an inconvenience someone needed to deal with, then you already understand what Evelyn felt in that moment. And if you've ever had to swallow that feeling because you had children depending on you to hold it together, then this story is going to hit somewhere deep. Stay with me until the end. Because what happens at that harvest table in Dry Willow is something I promise you won't see coming. And if this is your first time here, welcome. Hit that subscribe button and the bell so you never miss a story. Drop your city or country in the comments below. I want to see how far this story travels. Every comment means the world. Now let's go back to 1887, to a Wyoming territory autumn that nearly broke a woman who refused to be broken. The notice was nailed crookedly to the post outside the Dry Willow General Store, and Evelyn almost walked past it. She'd been walking past things for 3 weeks. Past the looks people gave a widow with 4 children and a canvas bag that held everything they still owned. Past the whispers at the church steps, where someone had given them bread 2 Sundays ago and not looked at her directly while doing it. The job postings that either required a husband present or paid so little she'd have been trading one kind of starvation for a slower one. But something made her stop. Ranch cook needed. Cedar Run, 3 miles east on the Harlan Road. Inquire at the gate. No wage listed, no requirement stated. Nothing about experience or references or whether a woman with children need apply. Just those 6 words and a hand-drawn arrow pointing east. Evelyn read it twice. Then she looked down at her children. Thomas was 11 and trying hard not to look hungry. Most of its windows were dark. Clara was 9 and had already spotted the arrow and was calculating the distance the way children do when they've learned that motion is better than standing still. The twins, Samuel and Ida, were 7, and Ida was holding her brother's hand because one of them always had to hold the other's hand, or they'd drift apart like untethered boats. Mama, Thomas said carefully. He had his father's way of making a single word carry a full question. 3 miles, Evelyn said, more to herself than to him. We walked 6 yesterday, Clara pointed out. That was true. And they had nothing to go back to in Dry Willow except a corner of the livery stable where the owner had let them sleep 2 nights, running out of something between pity and discomfort. And Evelyn knew that generosity had a shelf life. She shifted the canvas bag on her shoulder and looked east. Stay close, she said. And don't drag your feet, Ida. It scuffs the soles. They walked. The gate at Cedar Run was iron and solid, which surprised her. She'd expected a working ranch gate to be practical and worn, the kind that sagged on its hinges from years of daily use. This one looked like it had been built to impress someone who never came. There was a ranch hand leaning against the fence post, young, with the look of someone who'd drawn the short straw on gate duty. He straightened when he saw them coming down the road. You lost? Not unkindly. Just honestly confused. I'm here about the cook position, Evelyn said. He stared at her, then at Thomas, then at the twins, then back at Evelyn. Ma'am, we got 14 men working this ranch. I know what a ranch is, she said. He opened his mouth, closed it, then turned and walked toward the main house without another word. Whether that was a good sign or a bad one, Evelyn couldn't tell. She'd stopped being able to read signs clearly around the time the wagon wheel broke outside of Casper, and she'd had to sell the horse to pay for the repair, and then sold the wagon itself 2 days later because they couldn't pull it themselves. And she needed the money for food more than she needed a conveyance she couldn't use. That had been 5 weeks ago. It felt like 5 years. The children gathered close behind her without being told. Thomas put his hand briefly on her elbow, her son, who was 11 years old and already understood that sometimes you stood behind your mother because she needed to feel the weight of you there, even if she'd never asked for it. The man who came out of the main house was not what she expected. She'd pictured someone older, heavier, the kind of man who posted notices because he was too comfortable to be bothered cooking for himself. What she got was a man who walked like the ground, owed him nothing, and he wasn't asking it for favors. He was somewhere in his mid-30s, broad across the shoulders, in the way that comes from actual work rather than vanity. With a jaw that looked like it had been set against something for a long time and hadn't relaxed since. He stopped 10 feet from the gate and looked at her, not through her, at her, which was already different from most of the looks she'd gotten in Dry Willow. Gideon Rusk, he said. Evelyn Mercer. A pause. His eyes moved to the children, counted them, came back to her face. You looking for work or looking for somewhere to stay? He asked. The question was blunt, but not cruel. He genuinely wanted to know which problem he was being presented with. I'm looking for work, Evelyn said. The staying would be a condition of the work, same as any live-in position. I've got 14 men to feed 3 times a day. Breakfast before sunup, supper before dark, midday meal carried out to wherever they're working. I heard you, that's not a small job. No, she agreed. It's not. Gideon looked at her for a long moment. She could see him doing the math. A woman, 4 children, the worn-down look of someone who'd been surviving rather than living. The pride that was still, somehow, intact and working against him because it made her harder to dismiss than if she'd just shown up desperate. What experience do you have? He asked. I cooked for my husband and children for 11 years. Before that, I cooked at the Harlan boarding house in Nebraska for 2 years before I married. I know quantity. I know how to stretch a pantry. And I know how to get food on the table when the pantry's short. Boarding house isn't a working ranch. No, she said again. But hungry men are hungry men. Something shifted in his expression. Not softened exactly. More like a door that had been held shut with effort, moved a fraction of an inch. Kitchen's a mess, he said. Last cook walked off in July. Hands have been feeding themselves since. I'd like to see it, Evelyn said. I haven't offered you the position. No, she said. But you haven't turned me away either. Kitchen was worse than a mess. It was the kind of disorder that comes not from laziness, but from grief. Someone had stopped caring, and then stopped Jimenez. And then the dust had settled over everything. The way dust settles over things that used to matter. There were good pots. She noticed that immediately. Heavy iron, well made. And there had once been a system to the shelves. She could see the ghost of it, the rings where jars had stood in order, the hooks where things had hung before they taken down and not put back. Whoever had kept this kitchen before had known what she was doing. Evelyn stood in the middle of it and didn't let her face show what she was thinking. Gideon stood in the doorway with his arms crossed, watching her. What happened to the last cook? She asked. The silence lasted long enough that she turned to look at him. She was my wife, he said. She died 18 months ago. Evelyn looked back at the kitchen, the ghost of the jar rings, the empty hooks, the pots no one had touched since July, because 4 different men had tried and none of them could make the kitchen feel like it should. She understood that kind of disorder. She was living inside her own version of it. I'm sorry, she said, and she meant it without it meaning anything more than the words themselves. I'm not looking for sympathy, he said quickly. The door swung shut again. I know, she said. I'm not offering any. I'm just answering your question about the kitchen. He said nothing. I'll need to take inventory, she said. There's flour, salt, dried beans, anything cured. I can make supper tonight. Give me until sundown and I'll feed your 14 men. If a single one of them leaves that table hungry, I'll take my children and go before the dishes are washed. Gideon stared at her. Tonight, you've got hungry men and a kitchen that hasn't been used properly since July. Tonight seems like the right time to start. The silence stretched out between them and Evelyn did not fill it. She had learned in the last 5 weeks that silence was only unbearable if you were the one who needed it to end. She could wait. She'd gotten very good at waiting. Thomas, she said, without looking away from Gideon. Yes, ma'am. Her son appeared in the doorway beside the rancher, who glanced down at the boy with something surprised, as though he'd momentarily forgotten there were children attached to this negotiation. Take your sisters and Samuel and see what grows near the creek. Wild onions, if you can find them. Anything green that you recognize. Don't guess. Yes, ma'am. Thomas was already turning. And Thomas. He stopped. Be polite to anyone you meet on this property. Your guests until I say otherwise. He nodded and was gone, the sound of 4 pairs of feet fading into the yard. Gideon watched the space where they'd been. Guests, he repeated. I didn't want him thinking we'd already unpacked, Evelyn said. She was pulling a cloth from the canvas bag and had already begun clearing a space on the work table. I haven't agreed to your terms yet either. I haven't stated terms. Exactly, she said. So let's say we both evaluate tonight and talk in the morning. Gideon Rusk had been running this ranch alone for a year and a half. He had been negotiated with by cattle buyers, supply merchants, and men who thought his grief had made him soft and his land up for a conversation. He was not accustomed to being outmaneuvered at his own gate by a woman with 4 children and a canvas bag. He stood there for another moment. Then, because there was nothing else reasonable to do, he said, "Pantries through that door. There's a half sack of flour I know of. Check the root cellar for whatever's left." And he walked out. Evelyn let out a breath she'd been holding for approximately 3 miles. Then she pushed up her sleeves and went to find the flour. The pantry was better than the kitchen looked. Not good, but not hopeless. There was indeed flour and cornmeal and salt pork that had been hung and forgotten rather than properly smoked, but was still edible. Dried beans in 3 different jars, which was more than she'd hoped. Some dried herbs that smelled faintly of the woman who'd planted them, though Evelyn pushed that thought away, because she didn't have room for it right now. Thomas came back 40 minutes later with his pockets full of wild onions, his sisters carrying the hems of their skirts like baskets loaded with late-season greens and 2 varieties of root she taught them to recognize back when they still had a garden. Samuel had found, somewhat mysteriously, half a block of hard cheese wrapped in cloth near the bunkhouse, which he presented with the gravity of someone who had accomplished something significant and knew it. "Where did you get that?" Evelyn asked. "One of the cowboys gave it to me," Samuel said. "He said it was just sitting there." Evelyn doubted very much that it had been just sitting there, but she wasn't going to refuse it. "Thank the man," she said. "I did," Samuel said, twice. He looked surprised both times. Clara had already found a pencil and a paper somewhere in the kitchen and was sitting in the corner making a list of what Evelyn was pulling from shelves. 9 years old and already accounts is in her head. Evelyn noticed but didn't say anything. There would be time to talk about that later. Right now there was bread to make and a fire to build and 14 men who were going to walk through that door at sundown expecting to be fed. She worked. The children worked around her like water around stones, filling gaps, anticipating needs, making the kind of quiet teamwork that doesn't get taught. It gets earned through hard living and closeness. Thomas managed the fire with the competence of someone who'd been doing it since he was 8. Clara sorted and counted. The twins peeled onions in a shared silence, tears running freely down their faces, neither one remarking on it. Evelyn made bread first because bread was patience and structure, and she needed both right now. She made the stew next, building it slow, layering the salt pork with the beans and the onions and the greens, adding the cheese in small amounts near the end, because it had to work as a finisher, not a base. She found a jar of something at the back of the root cellar that turned out to be dried apple and made a small pan of it with the last of the cornmeal, not because it was necessary, but because no table should end without something sweet, even a small thing, even a near nothing. By the time the sun touched the top of the ridge line, the kitchen smelled like something Cedar Run hadn't smelled like in a year and a half. The hands came in one by one, big men with the dust of the day still on them, most of them looking at the full table with expressions that ranged from cautious hope to outright disbelief. A few of them noticed the children in the corner and gave Evelyn looks she chose not to interpret. Gideon was last through the door. He stopped at the threshold, and for a moment he didn't move, and Evelyn watched him from across the kitchen, this man who had built a wall around himself so careful and so thick that even his own house had felt it. She watched him take in the table, the bread, the steam rising off the pot, the smell that was doing something to the room that presence alone could not explain. He sat down at the head of the table without saying anything. The men ate, and they went quiet. Not the quiet of dissatisfaction ranch. Hands who don't like their food make that known with small sounds and push plates and sideways looks. This was the other kind of quiet. The kind that happens when something is so much better than expected that you stop talking because talking would interrupt it. Evelyn stood near the stove and watched, and kept the bread coming, and didn't say a word. Gideon's spoon hit the bowl. He stared at it, not at her. Bowl. As if the bowl had done something to him that he hadn't prepared for, and he was still catching up. One of the hands, A weathered man named Dale, who looked like he'd been on a horse since childhood, put his bread down and said, to no one in particular, Lord Almighty, that's actual food. A few of the men laughed, the loosened kind, the kind that comes after relief. Gideon looked up from the bowl. His eyes found Evelyn across the table. She held his gaze and waited. Sit down, he said quietly. Not an order. An invitation that he was clearly not entirely comfortable extending, but was extending anyway. We ate in the kitchen, Evelyn said. The children ate first while I finished cooking. Then at least he stopped. Something crossed his face she couldn't name. There's enough? There's plenty, she said. He nodded once and looked back at his bowl. And Dale said something to the man beside him, and the table noise came back. Warmer now, easier, and Evelyn let herself breathe for the first time since she'd started walking 3 miles east that morning. She had 32 cents and 4 children, and she was standing in a kitchen that didn't belong to her in a ranch that was barely breathing. But something was different now. She couldn't have named it exactly. She just knew, the way you know certain things before the words arrive, that whatever came next would not be the same as what came before. The morning after the supper that silenced 14 men, Evelyn woke before the rooster had any opinion about it. She lay still for a moment in the dark, listening to the breathing of her children around her. In the small room, Gideon had said nothing about, but had clearly prepared. There were 2 extra blankets folded at the foot of the cot that hadn't been there when they'd first walked through, and someone had filled the water pitcher on the shelf. She didn't know who had done it. She didn't ask. Some kindnesses are easier to receive when you don't have to look the person in the eye while accepting them. She got up, dressed quietly in the dark, the way she'd been dressing quietly in the dark for 11 years of motherhood, and went to start the breakfast fire. The kitchen was cold, but it was her cold now, if only temporarily, and there is a difference between a cold room that belongs to you and a cold room that doesn't. She built the fire with the same economy of motion she used for everything. No wasted moves, no dramatics. Just the practical understanding that wood is finite and heat is necessary, and the fastest path between them is focus. She was mixing the first batch of biscuit dough when Gideon appeared in the doorway. He was already dressed, which meant he'd been up even earlier than her, which meant either he was a man who simply didn't sleep much or he'd been awake for reasons that had nothing to do with the cattle. He looked at her at the work table, at the dough, at the fire already going, and something moved across his face that was too quick to read. You didn't have to start this early, he said. Breakfast before sunup, she said. That's what you told me. I didn't mean, he stopped. The men don't usually get biscuits. They will today. He was quiet for a moment, leaning in the doorway with his arms crossed in the particular way he had, which she was already beginning to understand, was not hostility so much as the posture of a man who had learned to occupy doorways rather than rooms, because rooms required a kind of commitment he wasn't making anymore. We haven't talked terms, he said. No, she agreed, turning the dough. We haven't. I need to know if you're staying. She looked up at him. I need to know what staying looks like before I can answer that. Most of its windows were dark. He pushed off the doorframe and came into the kitchen properly, which felt like a concession, and pulled out the chair at the end of the work table that wasn't covered in flour and sat in it. He put both hands flat on the table, like a man getting ready to deal cards. He wasn't sure he wanted to play. Room and board for you and the children, he said. The room you're in is small. There's a larger one at the back of the house that he paused. Been empty. You could use that, more space for 4 children. The room we have is fine for now, Evelyn said. She wasn't being difficult. She just knew that taking the larger room immediately meant taking something she might have to give back. And she'd given windows were dark, and she'd back enough things in the last year that she'd learned to hold what she had lightly until she was sure of the ground under her feet. Wages, he continued. I was paying Margaret, the woman before he stopped again. The name had come out before he decided to say it. I can pay what I paid her, $12 a month. Evelyn kept her hands in the dough. $12 a month was not generous, but it was not nothing, and more importantly, it was consistent, which was something she hadn't had in 5 weeks. That's acceptable, she said, with one condition. His eyes sharpened slightly. What condition? My children help on this ranch, and they don't do it for free. Not wage-free. Thomas is good with animals. I've watched him since he was small. He has a feel for horses that isn't common. If he works in your stable, I want him paid. Not much. $1 a month and the right to learn properly. He's 11, not a hand, but he's worth something, and I won't have him working for nothing. Gideon looked at her for a long moment. $1 a month, he repeated. And the learning, she said. The dollar without the learning is just cheap labor, and I didn't walk 3 miles to sell my son cheap. Gideon was quiet. Outside, somewhere in the yard, a horse moved against its stall door, and the sound carried clean through the cold morning air. And the girls? He asked. Clara helps me in the kitchen. That's family work, not hired work. I'm not asking you to pay a 9-year-old for helping her mother. Twins are 7. They can gather, they can carry small things, they stay out from underfoot during working hours. She paused. Clara's good with numbers. I noticed last night she was already cataloging the pantry inventory in her head. If you have accounts that need looking at, she'd benefit from the practice, and I'd benefit from knowing what's in the ledger. Something happened on Gideon's face that was hard to describe. It wasn't quite amusement. It was closer to the expression of a man who had expected to have a short, simple conversation about wages and found himself somewhere considerably more complicated. Your 9-year-old wants to look at my accounts, he said. She doesn't want to. She'll do it because it's useful, and she's the kind of child who finds useful things satisfying. Evelyn paused. She gets that from her father. It came out softer than she intended. She pushed past it. Those are my terms, she said. Room, board, $12 a month, $1 for Thomas with the right to learn the horses properly. Take them or I'll finish these biscuits and we'll be on the road by noon. Gideon looked at the dough, then at the fire, then at his hands flat on the table. Deal, he said, not warmly. But solidly, the way he probably said everything, like words were currency he didn't waste on decoration. He stood up, pushed the chair back, and was halfway to the door before he turned. The back room, he said. Think about it. It's got a window that faces east. And he left before she could respond, which she suspected was intentional. Cedar Run had its own rhythms, and they were not gentle ones. The hands were up before 6, out by 1/2 back in for midday if they were close enough to make it, and in the door by 7 or 8 at night, smelling of horses and hard work, and the particulars in hard work, and exhaustion that comes from physical labor in cold weather. They were not easy men to cook for, not because they were difficult, but because feeding 14 people 3 times a day with limited supplies and an unreliable delivery schedule from the Dry Willow Mercantile was a logistical problem that never fully resolved itself. It just changed shape. Evelyn was good at problems that changed shape. The first week was the hardest, not because of the cooking itself, but because of everything around it. She was learning a kitchen that wasn't hers, a pantry whose logic she hadn't built, a stove that ran hot on the left side and needed adjusting when the wind came from the north. She was learning which of the hands had dietary complaints they'd never mention, and which ones were quietly nursing injuries that made them eat slower. She was learning Gideon's schedule, not because he told it to her, but because she watched the way the house moved around him, the way water moves around a stone. Everything adjusted to where he was and wasn't. He ate alone the first 3 days, not hostile about it. He simply took his plate to the small room off the main hall that served as his office and ate there, and the door stayed mostly closed. Evelyn noticed and said nothing. On the 4th day, she sent Thomas to ask if he wanted coffee brought in. Thomas came back and said, he says he has coffee. On the 5th day, she sent Thomas in with a second biscuit without asking. Gideon came to the table for supper that night. He didn't announce it. He didn't explain it. He just walked in, sat at the head of the table with the same flat hands on the surface that he seemed to put everywhere as a form of claiming territory, and Dale looked up from his plate and said, "Evening, boss," and that was the entirety of the ceremony. Evelyn set his plate in front of him and moved on without making it a moment, because she understood that some doors only stay open if you don't look at them directly. Thomas, meanwhile, had made himself indispensable to the stable hand named Orrin before the end of the first week. Orrin was somewhere around 50, missing 2 fingers on his left hand from an incident he described vaguely as a disagreement with a fence post, and he had the manner of a man who had stopped expecting much from the world, and was, therefore, perpetually mildly surprised when anything good happened. He'd watched Thomas work around the horses for 2 days before he said anything to Evelyn. Your boy, he told her at the fence while she was hanging wash. He talks to them. He always has, she said. Not nonsense talk. Actual conversation, like he expects them to understand the meaning, not just the sound. Orrin rubbed the back of his neck. I've known grown men couldn't read a horse that well. How's he know which one is nervous versus which one is in pain? Started watching for the difference when he was about 4, Evelyn said. We had a plow horse who used to favor his right foreleg when he was anxious about thunder and his left foreleg when he was actually sore. Thomas noticed before my husband did. Orrin was quiet for a moment. He's got it natural, he said, like he was announcing the weather. I know, Evelyn said. I'll teach him what I know, Orrin said, which is considerable. I know that too, Evelyn said. That's why I asked. She didn't tell him she'd specifically observed which of the Cedar Run hands was best with horses before she negotiated that term of Thomas's arrangement. She'd learned from watching her husband that you don't reveal how much you know when you're still figuring out the room. Clara, meanwhile, had found the ranch accounts on her own. Evelyn discovered this on the 6th day, when she came in from the root cellar and found her daughter sitting at the kitchen table with a ledger book open in front of her, pencil in hand, lips moving slightly the way they did when she was running numbers. Where did you get that? Evelyn asked. Mr. Rusk left it on the kitchen table this morning. Clara looked up, think by accident. But, Mama, there are 3 places in here where the numbers don't match. Put it back where you found it. But, Clara. Her daughter looked at her steadily. The seed order for spring has been double counted. Someone paid twice for the same delivery and didn't note the credit. Evelyn set down what she was carrying and crossed to the table and looked at where Clara was pointing. The child was right. 3 separate entries, the kind of error that happens when a man is managing a ranch alone and his mind is on cattle and fence lines and not on whether the feed merchant's invoice matches the ledger. She stood there for a moment. Close it and put it back, she said, and don't touch it again unless you're asked. Yes, ma'am. Clara closed the ledger carefully. Then, are you going to tell him? That's my business, Evelyn said, not yours. But she was already thinking about how to say it. She chose an evening when the supper table had cleared and only Gideon remained with his coffee, which was another thing she'd noticed. He was the last one to leave the table now, which was a change from the first few days, and she didn't think it was accidental. I need to talk to you about the account, she said. He looked at her over the rim of the coffee cup. The accounts. The seed order from March. It was paid twice, and the credit wasn't recorded. You're carrying an overpayment of... She'd looked at the numbers herself after Clara had pointed them out. $14 to Hendrick's Supply. Gideon set the cup down slowly. How do you know what's in my accounts? He asked. Question was careful. Not angry, but careful. The way a man is careful when he's trying to figure out if he's been handled. My daughter found the ledger on the kitchen table this morning, Evelyn said. I told her to close it and put it back. But she'd already found the error. She's 9, and she can hold a column of numbers in her head without a page. She paused. I thought you should know about the overpayment. Gideon was quiet for a long time. $14, he said finally. $14.30, if the March delivery price was what's listed in February. He picked the cup back up, but didn't drink from it. He was looking at the middle distance, which was something she'd noticed he did when he was processing, rather than avoiding. There was a difference in the quality of his stillness, and she was beginning to understand which was which. Anything else? He asked. Not that I know of, she said. I only looked at what Clara pointed out. He nodded once, slowly. Then tell Clara. He stopped. Started again. If she finds something else, she can tell you and you can tell me. He seemed to be choosing words with some difficulty. I've been managing this alone for a while, and I'm not arrogant enough to think I haven't missed things. That's a reasonable position, Evelyn said. $14, he said again, quieter, like he was talking to himself more than her. 30 cents, she added. Something crossed his face that was not quite a smile but was in the same county as one, and he looked down at his coffee, and Evelyn picked up the serving plate from the center of the table and went back to the kitchen, and neither of them made anything of the moment. But the door stayed open. It was Dale who told her about Beatrice Crowell. He did it. The way men tell women things they think women should know, but aren't sure how to raise directly sideways, while doing something else with the studied casualness of someone who has rehearsed the approach. He came in one morning for a coffee refill about 15 minutes after the other hands had gone out, which was itself unusual enough that Evelyn registered it, and he stood at the stove holding his cup and looked at the window for a while before he said anything. "You know Dry Willow at all?" he asked. "Some," she said. "I've been in town twice since I arrived." "Then you might have seen the Mercantile on the main road." "I've seen it. Beatrice Crowell runs it," Dale said. "Has since her husband died 8 years back. Big operation. Half the ranches in this valley have credit with her." He turned the cup in his hands. "She and Gideon have a history. Nothing formal, no announcement, nothing you could put in writing. But she's had it in her head for a while that Cedar Run is going to be part of her future in one way or another." Evelyn kept her hands in the dishwater and kept her voice neutral. "Is that something Gideon has agreed to?" "Gideon hasn't agreed to much of anything since Martha died," Dale said, "which Beatrice has taken to mean the door is still open." "I see," Evelyn said. Dale finally looked at her directly. He had kind eyes and the face of a man who had seen enough of the world to be honest about it without enjoying being the one to deliver news. "She's going to hear about you, if she hasn't already. Town talks. You're a woman living on a working ranch with 4 children, and that's going to be the most interesting thing Dry Willow's had to discuss since the mill fire." "People can discuss what they like," Evelyn said. "Yes, ma'am," Dale said. "But Beatrice Crowell isn't most people." He set the cup down on the counter. "I just thought you should know the lay of the land." "Thank you, Dale," she said. He nodded and went back out, and Evelyn stood at the sink and stared at the window for a moment and then went back to the dishes. Because the dishes didn't care about Beatrice Crowell, and there was still a midday meal to prepare. But she filed the information away in the part of her mind where she kept the things that required patience rather than immediate action, and she thought about it during the noon prep, and she thought about it again that evening, and windows were dark, and she was thinking about it still when she heard the sound that stopped everything. It came from the stable, not the usual horse sounds, the shifting and the soft complaints of animals settling in for the night. This was higher and more urgent, and Evelyn recognized it before her mind had fully processed it, because she'd heard Thomas make that sound exactly once before, when he was 8 and had reached into a hayloft and found something that bit. She was out of the kitchen and across the yard before she'd taken a breath. The stable door was open, and Orrin was already inside. And Thomas was pressed against the far wall with his right arm held against his chest, and one of the younger horses, a roan that Evelyn had heard the men call Trouble without any great affection, was pacing in the stall with the tight circular energy of an animal that had frightened itself. "Thomas." She crossed to him in 4 steps and took his face in her hands. "Look at me, where are you hurt?" "My arm," he said. His voice was steady, which cost him something. She could see it costing him. He didn't mean it. He spooked at something, and I was too close. Orrin was already at the horse's stall door, talking low and steady, and the roan was beginning to slow its circles. Evelyn ran her hands down Thomas's arm, careful, pressing gently at intervals, the way her own mother had taught her to find where pain lived without asking the person to name it. He winced at the elbow. "Not broken," she said, more to herself than him. "But you'll feel it tomorrow." "I know," he said. "What happened?" Thomas explained it quietly, the sequence of it, where he'd been standing, what the horse had done, what he should have anticipated, and hadn't. Not making excuses. Explaining the mechanics of the mistake with the precision of someone who was already turning the experience into a lesson rather than a wound. Orrin, from the stall, said, "He's right about all of it. And he kept his head when it happened, which isn't nothing. Most boys his age would have run or yelled and made it worse." Thomas looked at Evelyn with something in his eyes that was not quite a question, more like a test of what her face would say. She looked at her son, this 11-year-old boy who had his father's careful eyes and her stubborn jaw and had been holding himself together with both hands for 5 weeks of hard travel and uncertainty. She said, "Let's get some cold water on that elbow." She did not say, "Be more careful," or "You should have known," or "I told you." She had been told those things herself enough to know they were useless after the fact, and only useful before it. She said, "Orrin's right. You kept your head." Thomas nodded once. His jaw was tight. She didn't make him say anything else. She walked him back across the yard toward the house, her hand between his shoulder blades, and partway across the yard she heard the creak of the porch and looked up to find Gideon standing there in the dark, watching. He'd seen enough to understand what had happened, she could tell. From the angle of his body, The particular stillness of a man who has absorbed a scene without inserting himself into it. "You all right?" Gideon asked. Quiet, directed at her, not Thomas. "He's fine," Thomas said before Evelyn could answer. 11 years old and already insisting on speaking for himself about himself. Gideon looked at the boy for a moment. Then he said, "Trouble's a hard read. Oren's been working with him for 3 months, and he still gets surprised." Thomas absorbed this. "I should have watched his ears longer before I came in close." "Yes," Gideon said, "no cushion on it. Just agreement. You should have." And then after a pause, "You'll know to next time." It was not a warm thing to say. But Thomas straightened slightly, and Evelyn understood that warmth was not what her son had needed in that moment. He'd needed to be taken seriously, which is its own form of kindness. She guided him inside, and behind her she heard Gideon's boots on the porch steps, heading back toward the stable, probably to check on Oren and the horse, because Cedar Run was what he did when he didn't know what else to do with himself. That was all right. She understood that kind of refuge. She had her kitchen. He had his ranch. 2 weeks in, the pantry began to look like a pantry again. This was partly a practical achievement. She'd reorganized everything by frequency of use and rate of consumption, and had negotiated a standing order with the Dry Willow General Store through a supply boy who came out twice a week, bypassing the mercantile where possible because she didn't yet want to be in the position of Beatrice Crowell, knowing the exact volume of what Cedar Run needed to operate. That instinct turned out to be a good one. But the pantry was also something else, which was evidence of a system. And systems were what Evelyn built when she was starting to believe a place might last. She hadn't let herself do it in the first week. She'd used things efficiently, but she hadn't reorganized, because reorganizing was an investment, and she was still carrying enough experience of places that hadn't lasted to be careful about where she put that investment. The second shelf, going left to right, flour, then cornmeal, then dried beans, then shores, then salt, was the moment she admitted to herself that she was trying to stay. Clara saw her do it and didn't say anything. But that evening she asked if she could have a piece of paper. "What for?" Evelyn asked. "I want to write down what's on each shelf," Clara said, "so I know what we need before it runs out instead of after." Evelyn gave her 2 pieces of paper, the pencil from the kitchen drawer. 3 days later, Clara presented her with a hand-drawn inventory chart, items listed by category with small columns to mark depletion rates, all in the careful, cramped handwriting of a child who had taught herself to write small because paper was not always available. Evelyn looked at it for a long time. "Where did you learn to make this?" she asked. "I made it up," Clara said, with the simplicity of someone stating a fact they didn't realize was unusual. Evelyn folded the chart and put it in her apron pocket and kept it there. That evening she showed it to Gideon without explanation, just set it on the table in front of him during the quiet after supper when the hands had gone and the kitchen was settling. He looked at it, turned it, looked at it again. "Clara?" he asked. "Clara," she confirmed. He set it down, picked up his coffee. "She's 9, she'll be 10 in March." He looked at the chart again. "The depletion columns," he said. She thought of that herself. She said she wanted to know what we needed before it ran out instead of after. Gideon was quiet. Then he said, slowly, "My wife used to say that the difference between a ranch that doesn't is almost never the cattle. It's almost always the house." He didn't say it like a compliment. He said it like a thing he'd been carrying for a while that had found its way out by accident. Evelyn didn't respond immediately. She picked up the empty coffee cup he'd set down and turned it in her hands. "Your wife was right," she said. He looked at her. And for a moment something passed between them that was not about wages or pantries or 9-year-old girls with inventory charts. And then it passed, and Gideon stood up and said he needed to check the north fence before dark, which was not a thing that needed checking at that hour. And they both knew it, but neither of them said so. It was on the 18th day that Beatrice Crowell came to Cedar Run. Evelyn heard the carriage before she saw it, the particular high-stepping sound of a well-kept horse on the approach road. Not a working horse, but a displayed one. And she was standing at the kitchen window when it came through the gate. Beatrice Crowell was not what Evelyn had pictured from Dale's description. She'd imagined someone harder. The woman who climbed down from that carriage was composed, in the way that certain women are composed, not calm, but controlled, the difference being that calm has nothing to prove, and control is always in conversation with what it fears. She was handsome, well-dressed for the territory, and she moved through the yard with the confidence of a woman who had been to Cedar Run before and intended to continue coming to Cedar Run and wanted everyone watching to understand that. She looked at the yard, at the clean state of the porch, at the smoke coming steady from the kitchen chimney, at the children's shoes lined up beside the door, which Evelyn had required because tracking mud through the house was something she had opinions about. Then she looked at Evelyn through the kitchen window, and her expression did something so quick and so precise that Evelyn almost missed it, a contraction or a calculation. The face of a woman who had expected disorder and found the opposite, and was not pleased about either. Gideon came from the stable, which meant he'd heard the carriage, too. He crossed the yard and said something to Beatrice that Evelyn couldn't hear from the window, and Beatrice said something back. And then they both looked at the house. Evelyn went to the door and opened it before anyone could knock. "Good afternoon," she said. Beatrice Crowell looked at her directly for the first time, not through her. At her, the same as Gideon had done at the gate, but the quality of it was entirely different. Gideon's look had been assessment. This was inventory of a different kind. "You must be the cook," Beatrice said. "I'm Evelyn Mercer," Evelyn said. "Can I offer you coffee?" The question was deliberate, not hospitality as performance. A clean offer with nothing attached to it. Beatrice was standing in the yard of a ranch that was not hers, and Evelyn was standing in the doorway of a kitchen she ran, and both of them understood the geometry of that arrangement, even if only one of them had expected it. "Thank you," Beatrice said, and smiled in the way that people smile when they are filing information. She came in. She looked at the kitchen, the organized shelves, clean work table, the small vase of late wild asters on the windowsill that Ida had put there 3 days ago, and Evelyn had left because the child had been so careful about where she placed it. Beatrice looked at the vase longest. "How many children did you say you had?" she asked. "I didn't say," Evelyn said, pouring coffee. "4. And they're all here? On the property?" "This is where I work," Evelyn said. "This is where they are." Beatrice accepted the coffee cup and looked at Gideon, who was standing in the kitchen doorway in his usual position, arms crossed, watching. The look she gave him contained an entire conversation that Evelyn was only receiving part of, the history of two people who had been in careful negotiation about a future that one of them wanted more than the other. "Gideon," Beatrice said pleasantly, "you didn't mention you'd hired a family." "I hired a cook," Gideon said. "Of course." Beatrice smiled at him, and then at Evelyn, and then at the kitchen. "It looks very practical." "Practical," said in that tone, was not a compliment. It was the word you used when you wanted to indicate that something was merely adequate. A kitchen could be many things: inviting, warm, elegant, thoughtful. Practical meant it was doing the minimum and not embarrassing anyone. Evelyn heard it and put it in the same pocket where she'd put Dale's warning and everything else she was collecting that would take patience instead of response. "Thank you," she said, as though it had been a compliment. Beatrice looked at her. Something shifted. She had expected Evelyn understood to find chaos. Come-outs-of-its windows were dark. She'd come out here expecting the evidence that would support the story she was already telling in Dry Willow. A widow in over her head, a rancher who'd made a sentimental decision, a situation that required intervention from someone with more standing. She'd come here to collect proof. She was standing in a clean kitchen drinking coffee poured by a woman who had not flinched once. That was not the story Beatrice had come for. She stayed 40 minutes. She was polite throughout. She said careful things about the ranch, about the territory, about how well Gideon must be managing on his own. She did not direct anything to Evelyn that was openly hostile. She didn't need to. The hostility was all in the structure of what she chose to address and what she chose to look through. When she stood to leave, she paused at the kitchen door and turned back, and Evelyn was at the work table beginning the supper prep, and Beatrice said, in a voice bright as a new coin, "Oh, I don't know if you've heard, but the harvest gathering is the last Saturday of October. The whole town turns out. Everyone brings something." She looked at Evelyn with that careful smile. "I always do a full table. It's become rather expected." "I'm sure it has," Evelyn said. "Will you be attending? With the children?" Pause before the children was deliberate. A small blade, thin enough to slide between ribs without looking like a weapon. Evelyn looked up from the work table. "I expect so," she said. Beatrice nodded, still smiling, and left. Gideon didn't come back inside immediately. Evelyn could hear the carriage leaving, and then the yard going quiet, and then his footsteps on the porch, slow and deliberate. He came into the kitchen and stood at the work table across from her. Evelyn, he started. Don't, she said. Not unkindly, just firmly. He stopped. I know what that was, she said. She was chopping onions, which was convenient because it gave her eyes something to do other than be read. And I know what's coming. I don't need you to explain it to me, and I don't need you to manage it on my behalf. I wasn't... You were about to, she said. You were about to say something that would make you feel better and would make me feel managed. And I've been managed by people who meant well before, and I don't like it. Gideon was very still. Then what do you need? He asked. It was a genuinely good question, one she hadn't expected him to ask, and it stopped her for a moment. She set down the knife. I need you to let me handle it, she said. My way. In my time. She looked at him. Can you do that? He held her gaze for a moment. Then he said, yes, in the same tone he'd said deal no decoration, just solidity. And Evelyn picked the knife back up and went back to the onions, and the kitchen, filled with the smell of them, and outside the last light was going down over the ridge. And Cedar Run was quiet, in the way it was beginning to be quiet when things were working, instead of merely holding. She did not tell Gideon what she was planning to bring to the harvest gathering. She kept that to herself, in the pocket with everything else. For now, there was supper to make, and the 14 men who would come through that door in an hour were hungry in the good, honest way that men are hungry when they've done real work in cold air, and that was something she understood how to answer. Everything else could wait. The last Saturday of October came in cold and gray, the kind of morning that makes Wyoming feel like it's settling a score with whoever thought autumn was gentle. Evelyn had been awake since 4, not because of the gathering, or not only because of it. She'd been awake because Samuel had a cough that had started 3 days ago and hadn't fully decided what it wanted to become, and she'd spent an hour in the dark listening to him breathe with the particular attention of a mother who has learned that the difference between a cough and one that doesn't is sometimes audible if you're quiet enough to hear it. He was all right. The cough was shallow and wet and annoying rather than deep and dry and dangerous, and she'd made him a tea with dried thyme and honey from the jar she kept on the second shelf for exactly this kind of thing, and he'd gone back to sleep with the boneless ease of a 7-year-old who trusts that the person watching over him knows what they're doing. Evelyn wished, not for the first time, that she felt as certain about that as Samuel did. She got up and went to the kitchen and started the bread. Not for the gathering. Not yet. The bread for the gathering would be started later, at a specific time she'd already calculated, because bread for a gathering needed to be warm when it arrived, and the timing of bread was a kind of precision that looked effortless only to people who'd never thought about it. This bread was just the morning bread, the daily bread, the bread that would be on the table when the hands came in before they rode out, because the work of this ranch didn't pause for gatherings or anything else, and 14 men still needed breakfast. She was on the second batch when Gideon appeared in the doorway. This had become, without either of them naming it as such, a kind of morning ritual. He appeared. She was already working. Coffee was already on. He would pour his own cup, because she had stopped offering, and he had stopped waiting to be offered, and he would stand or sit, depending on what the day felt like, and they would talk about what needed talking about, which was usually ranch business, but was occasionally something else. This morning he looked at the bread, then at her, then at the window where the sky was still dark. You didn't sleep, he said. Samuel's cough, she said. He nodded. He'd heard it. His room was down the hall from the back room she'd eventually moved into, the east-facing one, and sound carried in this house in ways she was still mapping. He's all right, Gideon asked. He will be, she said, which was not the same as yes. Gideon had enough experience with animals that weren't fully well to understand the distinction between those two answers. He poured his coffee and sat at the table. You don't have to go today, he said, to the gathering. Evelyn didn't look up from the dough. I know I don't have to. I'm saying if Samuel's not well, Samuel is not so unwell that I'm going to miss the harvest gathering, she said. Clara can sit with him. She's done it before and she'll tell me if he worsens. Gideon was quiet for a moment. Then Beatrice will have the south corner set up by 9. She always does. Best position in the square. You can see it from every direction. Evelyn still didn't look up. I know. I'm not telling you what to. I know you're not, she said. She let that sit for a second before she added, more evenly, and I appreciate that you're not. But I don't need a report on Beatrice Crowell's table positioning. He wrapped both hands around his cup the way he did when he was holding something back. What are you bringing? He asked. She finally looked at him. Bread, she said. He waited, as though the rest of the sentence was coming. Just bread? He said. And butter, she said. I churned it yesterday. The look he gave her was complicated, not dismissive. More like the look of a man who was trying to calculate an outcome with insufficient information and was unsettled by the gap. Beatrice is going to have a full table, he said carefully. Roasted meats, preserves, probably a cake or two. She does it every year, and it costs her. It's not a small presentation. I know, Evelyn said. And you're bringing bread and butter. Yes. He looked at her for a long moment. Then he picked up his coffee, and he said, all right, in the tone of a man who has decided to trust something he can't fully see yet, which was either wisdom or surrender, and he hadn't decided which. All right, Evelyn agreed. She went back to the dough. The harvest gathering in Dry Willow was the social event of the year in the way that events become significant in small, isolated communities, not because they are grand, but because they are one of the few times everyone occupies the same space at the same time, and everything said and unsaid and displayed and withheld carries the weight of all the months between gatherings. The square was already busy when Evelyn arrived with Thomas, the twins, and the bread wrapped in cloth, and still warm from the timing she'd calculated to the quarter hour. Clara had stayed with Samuel, who had been indignant about it, and had expressed this indignation in the specific way of 7-year-old boys loudly, and then suddenly asleep again. The gathering had the particular feeling of a performance that everyone was performing for everyone else simultaneously. There were tables set up around the square perimeter, families clustered, children running, the smell of wood, smoke, and cooling food and autumn air that had sharpened overnight into something that required a coat. Evelyn saw Beatrice's table from 50 feet away. It was objectively impressive. A full white cloth on a long table in the south corner, exactly where Gideon had said it would be. There were 2 roasted birds, what looked like 3 different kinds of preserved fruit, in glass jars arranged by color, a ham that had been glazed with something, rolls in a basket with a folded napkin, 2 cakes, 1 frosted, and a small centerpiece of dried flowers arranged with the care of someone who had considered the arrangement. People were already gravitating toward it the way people gravitate toward the most polished thing in a room, not necessarily because it's the best, but because it signals something about who made it. Evelyn kept walking until she found an open section of table near the middle of the square, not a corner, not prominent, just an available space. She set her basket down and unwrapped the bread. 2 loaves. Round, golden, the crust cracked in the particular way it does when the dough has proofed correctly and the oven was hot enough. The butter was in a small crock beside them. She'd added nothing else. No dried flowers, no cloth. Thomas, standing beside her, looked at Beatrice's table and then at their 2 loaves. Mama, he said carefully. Don't, she said. He didn't. Ida tugged at her skirt. Is that enough? It's what we have, Evelyn said. And it's good. She said it the way she said things when she needed her children to believe them before she was fully certain she did herself. The morning moved the way these things move, in overlapping currents of conversation and food and children underfoot and men discussing weather and cattle prices with the animated concerns of people who lived by both. Evelyn spoke with a few people who introduced themselves with genuine curiosity, the kind she'd begun to recognize in Dry Willow. Not everyone was Beatrice Crowell, and most people were simply people trying to understand who the new woman at Cedar Run was and whether she was someone they could like. She was careful and warm and didn't say more than she needed to. She watched the bread. A woman named Ruth, who turned out to run the small lending library with her husband, came over and took a slice without ceremony, ate it, and said, "Who made this?" "I did," Evelyn said. "Cedar Run's new cook," Ruth said. There was something shrewd and friendly about her, the combination of a woman who reads a great deal and has opinions about everything she reads. "That's me," Evelyn said. "This is very good bread," Ruth said, in the tone of someone who didn't say things like that without meaning them. "My husband makes bread, and it's adequate. And I've told him so many times, and he continues to be adequate at it. Has he tried soaking the flour the night before? Evelyn asked. Ruth blinked. I don't know. Has he? If you want softer crumb, you soak it. Takes planning, but it's worth it. I'm going to tell him that, Ruth said. He'll argue with me. He argues with everything I tell him about bread. Most people do, Evelyn said, until they try it. Ruth took a second slice. I'm coming to you for advice from now on bread or general matters. Both, Ruth said, and smiled, and moved on. That was the first one. The second was a rancher's wife named Helen, who'd been watching from across the square and came over with a kind of directness that Evelyn respected because at least it wasn't performing something else. She asked a few questions about the ranch, about the children, about where they'd come from, and Evelyn answered honestly and without elaborating more than was asked. I heard Beatrice paid you a visit, Helen said. She came out to see the ranch, Evelyn said. She was polite. Helen's expression suggested she'd heard a different version of polite described in relation to Beatrice before. I'm sure she was, she said. And then, that's good bread. Thank you. Better than Beatrice's rolls, Helen added, and then looked like she'd surprised herself by saying it, and walked away. Evelyn looked down at the loaves. One was half gone. She sliced the other and laid it open and set a small knife in the butter. She did not look at Beatrice's table. She didn't need to. She could feel the geometry of it from here. Beatrice came at 11. She came the way she did everything, with the deliberate grace of someone who's choreographed their own entrances, stopping to speak to people along the way, laughing at the right moments, touching an arm here, acknowledging a name there. She was good at this. Evelyn would have had to be dishonest not to recognize that. She arrived at Evelyn's table the way a ship arrives at a particular harbor, not by accident. She looked at the 2 loaves, at the butter crock, at the people currently eating from them. Then she looked at Evelyn and said, pleasantly, with the whole square available to hear if it wanted to, "Oh, how sweet. Did you not have time to prepare more? I know it must be difficult, managing the ranch and 4 children. I imagine there's hardly a spare moment." She said it the way you drop something from a hype casual on the outside, but calculated to the inch. A few people nearby went quiet. Evelyn looked at Beatrice directly. I had time, she said. I just brought what I knew was good. Beatrice's smile didn't move. Of course, she said. Simple is lovely. There's something very rustic about it. She glanced at the half-gone loaf. I see people are being kind. The word kind said in that tone meant pity. The whole sentence meant people are taking your bread because they feel sorry for you. The nearby quiet spread slightly. Evelyn picked up the bread knife and cut a clean slice from the remaining loaf and set it on the cloth in front of her and said nothing. Because she had learned a long time ago, and at some cost, that the only answer to a blade like that was to not bleed in public. She kept her face composed. She kept her hands steady. She thought Samuel's were dark. She thought about Samuel's cough, and whether she'd left enough thyme tea, and whether Clara knew to add honey, and not just the herb, and she thought about the fact that Beatrice Crowell had to come to this table to say what she'd said, which meant Beatrice Crowell had been watching this table, which meant something. But Beatrice wasn't finished. She tilted her head slightly and said, to the small audience that had accumulated without quite meaning to, I do think it's admirable, what Gideon has done, taking in a family in difficult circumstances. He's always had a generous heart. Some people might call it overly generous. The pause was surgical, but I suppose he knows his own business. Taking in a family. The phrase stripped everything out. The work, the wages negotiated and met, the pantry reorganized, the accounts corrected, the bread fed to 14 men every day. All of it collapsed into charity, into a widow and her children as objects of someone's generosity rather than contributors to a working ranch. Evelyn opened her mouth, and then she didn't say anything, because someone else spoke first. That's an interesting way to put it. Gideon was standing 6 feet behind Beatrice. Most of its windows were dark. Nobody had seen him arrive. He'd come in from the edge of the square, which was where he'd been talking with 2 ranchers from the North Valley, and he'd walked over here in the middle of Beatrice's sentence and had apparently heard enough of it. Beatrice turned. The smile adjusted but didn't go away. Gideon, I was just saying. I heard what you were saying, he said. He wasn't loud. He almost never was. But there was a quality to his voice when he used it this way like a door, closing in a quiet house that made the space around it go still. He looked at Beatrice for a moment, and whatever was in that look was something they shared a history of. A history of implied agreements and half-stated expectations and patience wearing thin on both sides. Then he turned away from her and walked to Evelyn's table, and he reached past the buttercrock and picked up a slice of bread without looking at anyone in particular, and he said, loudly enough, "Ruth, Helen, have you tried this?" Helen, who was 3 feet away and had been watching with the contained attention of someone at a theater, said 3 times. Ruth, who had drifted back near the table, said, "I'm on my 4th. Gideon looked at the bread in his hand for a moment, the same way he'd looked at that first bowl of stew in his own kitchen, not at her, but at the thing she'd made, as if the thing itself was saying something he needed a moment to receive. Then he said, to no one specifically, and therefore to everyone, Cedar Run's been running better in the last month than it has in 2 years. That's not my management. That's a woman who rebuilt a household that I'd let fall apart, and 4 children who pitched in alongside her, and a kitchen that's been earning its keep every day." He took a bite of the bread, chewed. "I didn't take anyone in. I hired someone worth hiring." The square was the kind of quiet that gathers around something real. Beatrice's expression did not collapse, because she was too practiced for that. But something behind it shifted. The recalculation Evelyn had seen the day she'd come to Cedar Run, now more urgent, looking for a new position to hold. She didn't find one fast enough, because Dale, who had come to the gathering with Orrin and 2 of the other hands, chose this particular moment to walk to the table and pick up the last of the bread, and Orrin was a step behind him, and the other 2 behind Orrin, and they didn't say anything. They just stood there, eating bread from the table of the woman they'd been eating supper with for a month, which was a statement without being a speech. Helen said into the quiet, "I'd like the recipe." Ruth said, "I'd like the advice about the flour again. My husband is about to have it explained to him whether he wants to or not." Somebody's laughed, and then somebody else did. And the particular configuration of who was standing where and what it meant redistributed itself the way crowds do when the thing they gathered around resolves. Beatrice Crowell turned and walked away toward her own table with her spine very straight, which was the only thing she had left to be precise about. Evelyn watched her go. She felt Thomas's hand briefly find her elbow from behind her, the same gesture as the first day at the gate, this 11-year-old boy who was paying attention to, more than she always gave him credit for. She did not cry. She was not going to cry in the dry willow town square. She covered the remaining butter with the cloth and straightened the knife. Gideon came to stand beside her. He didn't say anything. He'd said what's needed saying, and he wasn't the kind of man to undermine a thing he'd just done by adding more words to it. But he stood there, and that was its own language, the kind that doesn't translate into sentences but is perfectly clear anyway. "You finished the bread," Evelyn said. "You can make more," he said. "I can make more," she agreed. The walk back to Cedar Run in the afternoon was quiet in a different way than the walk had been quiet that morning. The morning quiet had been the quiet of things as not yet decided. This was the quiet of things that had been decided and were still settling into their new positions. Thomas walked beside her. The twins ran ahead until Evelyn called them back within sight range. The breadbasket was empty, and the butter crock had been rinsed at the well before she'd packed it, and the cloth was still slightly damp in her hands. "Mama," Thomas said. Why only bread?" She thought about how to answer that. Not about what the answer was, she'd known that for 3 weeks. Since the moment she'd stood at Beatrice's kitchen door and registered the full calculation Beatrice was making. She thought about how to explain it to a boy who was old enough to understand strategy, but young enough to still believe that the better thing always wins just by being better. She said, "'Cause I knew it was the best thing I made. And I knew that walking in with everything, I had to prove myself to a room that was already being told I had nothing to prove would look like what it was. Desperation." Thomas was quiet, absorbing this. "But with just bread," he said slowly. "With just bread," Evelyn said, "I walked in saying I know what I'm worth. The bread says the rest." He was quiet for another stretch of road. "It worked," he said. "We'll see," she said. Today was one day. She meant it. She wasn't satisfied in the way that meant finished. Satisfied in the way that means one battle is over and you can eat your supper tonight without a knot in your chest. But you don't let yourself believe the war is behind you, because that's when people get careless. She knew Beatrice Crowell well enough by now to know that today had not ended anything. It had changed the terms of it. What happened when they got back to Cedar Run was not what Evelyn expected. She'd expected quiet. She'd expected to check on Samuel, start supper, let the day decompress into the ordinary rhythm of the kitchen. What she found instead was a wagon parked in the yard that didn't belong to any of the hands, and Orrin at the stable door with the expression of a man who had been trying to manage something by himself and was relieved to see her. "What's happened?" she said. "Neighbor from the East Valley," Orrin said. "Caleb Marsh. He came by about an hour ago. His wife's been sick, and they're running short." Orrin glanced toward the house. He heard that Cedar Run had a decent pantry. Evelyn looked at the wagon. A man was sitting in the seat, 40 or so, with the look of a person who had spent his pride on the trip here and had very little of it left for the asking. She went to the wagon. The man watched her come and didn't speak first, which was the pride talking, so she spoke instead. "I'm Evelyn Mercer," she said. "I run the kitchen here." "Caleb Marsh," he said. "I'm not—" He stopped. Started again. "My wife's been sick 6 weeks. We've got 2 boys. I'm not looking for charity. What are you short on?" she said. He looked at her, then away. "Flour, mostly. Dried beans if you have them. Anything that stretches." Evelyn thought about the pantry. About the inventory chart Clara had made, now on its 3rd version, because Clara kept improving it. About exactly what was on the 2nd shelf and the 3rd, and what could be moved without shortfall in Cedar Run's own coming week. "Come inside," she said. "Ma'am, I don't need to. I'm not asking you to sit down for tea," she said. "I'm asking you to come inside while I pack what I can spare, which will take 10 minutes, and then you can be back on the road." Came inside. Clara was at the kitchen table with Samuel, who was indeed awake now and looking considerably better, and who looked at the stranger with the open curiosity of a child who has been mostly around family for weeks. Clara had already closed the ledger she'd been studying. Gideon had, at some point over the last week, begun leaving it on the kitchen table, deliberately rather than accidentally, an arrangement that nobody had formally acknowledged. Evelyn went to the pantry. She took flour. Not all she could spare. She calculated it against what would be needed by end of week and took slightly less than the maximum because margins mattered. Dried beans. A small sack of cornmeal. A jar of the apple preserves she'd put up 10 days ago from the last of the season's fruit. She hesitated over the preserves. It was an extra thing, not a necessity, and then put it in the basket anyway, because a sick woman probably hadn't had anything sweet in 6 weeks. She carried it back to the table. Caleb Marsh looked at the basket. "What do I owe you?" he said. His voice was careful, the voice of a man managing a complicated set of feelings. "Nothing," she said. "And before you say you don't take charity, I'm going to say that this isn't charity. This is a neighbor with a surplus, helping a neighbor with a shortage, and we can call it that. And if you're in a position to return the favor to someone at some point, then you can do that. But that's between you and yourself, and not a condition of this basket." He looked at her for a moment. "You're the widow," he said. It wasn't unkind. It was just the way information presented itself to him. They said you came from nothing." "I came from Casper," she said, by way of a broken wagon. Something loosened in his face. Not a smile, just the letting go of the formality that had been holding him together. "My wife makes good bread when she's well," he said. "Then she'll make it again," Evelyn said. She handed him the basket. "The apple preserves are in the cloth. Tell her to eat them with whatever she has. Not all at once, she'll want to, but tell her to go slow." He took the basket. He said, "Thank you." And then he said something she hadn't expected. He said, "I heard what happened in town today, with Beatrice Crowell." Evelyn looked at him. "Word travels fast," she said. "Dry willow," he said. "Everything travels fast." He shifted the basket. "I just thought you should know that there's more than a few people in this valley who've been on the receiving end of Beatrice Crowell's idea of what she's owed." He nodded once. "That's all." He left. Evelyn stood in the kitchen and listened to the wagon moving out of the yard. And Samuel said, "Mama, who was that?" And she said, "A neighbor." And Samuel said, "Is he coming back?" And she said, "I don't know," and went to check what was left in the pantry and make a note for Clara's inventory chart. Gideon found out about it that evening. Not from her, From Orrin, which was how Gideon found out most things that happened on the property when he wasn't for them, because Orrin had the ranching instinct of reporting to the person in charge without being asked. He came to the kitchen after supper. The hands had cleared, the table was wiped, the fire was banked for the night, and he stood in the doorway in the way he had, not quite coming in, not quite leaving. "You gave Caleb Marsh from our pantry," he said. "I gave him what we could spare," she said. "I calculated against the week's needs before I touched anything." "I know," he said. "That's not." He came into the kitchen then, all the way, and sat in the chair at the end of the work table. "His wife's been sick a while. I didn't know he was that short." "He probably didn't want you to know," she said. Gideon was quiet. He put his hands flat on the table and looked at them in the way he looked at things he was thinking through, rather than things he was avoiding. "You didn't ask me," he said. Not accusatory, just observing. She looked at him steadily. "No, I didn't. You were in town. I made the decision that was in front of me with the information I had. If you want me to ask before I give anything to a neighboring family that's short, I need to know that now, so we're clear on what my authority in this kitchen is and isn't." He held her gaze. The question she just laid down was not a small one. It was the edge of the thing they'd been navigating since the first morning. What was her domain? What was his? And whether those two things could coexist in the same ranch without one of them eating the other alive. "You manage the household," he said. "What goes in and out of the kitchen is yours to manage. Then I don't need to ask." "No," he said, "you don't." A pause. "What you did today," he said, and then stopped. Like he'd walked into a room he hadn't planned to enter. He tried again. "At the gathering, the bread." "It was just bread," she said. "No," he said. "It wasn't." She waited, because he was clearly working towards something, and she'd learned that pushing him mid-thought produced less than waiting. "When Martha was alive," he said slowly, like he was laying something down carefully, this ranch had a way of being a place where people came. Not just the hands. Neighbors. People who were short or struggling. She had a way of making it feel like coming here was normal. Not charity, just, he paused, normal. Evelyn looked at the table between them. He stopped again. "I haven't done that since she died. I haven't been the kind of neighbor she would have wanted Cedar Run to be." "You've been managing grief," Evelyn said. Not softly, just accurately. "That's not an excuse." "I didn't say it was," she said. "I said what it was." He looked at her. "The both things, the gathering and Caleb Marsh, that's closer to what this ranch should be." He said it the way a man says a thing he's been wanting to say and hasn't been sure he had the right to, directly, without softening it, but without being entirely steady either. "I didn't hire you to do that. I hired you to cook." "I know," she said, "but you did it anyway." "I did what was in front of me," she said. He looked at her for a moment, longer than was strictly necessary for the conversation they were having, and then he nodded once, the way he confirmed things, and he pushed back from the table. "Tomorrow," he said, "I'm going to ride out to the East Valley." "To see Marcia's wife?" she asked. "To see if there's anything else they need that doesn't fit in a basket." She looked at him. He was already heading for the door, hands in his pockets, the way he moved when he was done being still, and needed to be in motion to think. "Gideon," she said. He stopped, turned. "Take some of the apple preserves," she said. "I put up more than we need." He held her gaze for a moment. Then he said, "All right." And he went out, and the kitchen settled into the quiet that was its own kind of sound by now. Not empty, but full of what it held, what it had stored up over the last month in this kitchen that had been cold and was not cold anymore. Evelyn banked the fire for the night and took the lamp from the hook and stood for a moment in the dimness of the kitchen. She thought about Beatrice Crowell's face when the square had gone quiet, the recalculation behind those careful eyes. She thought about what Dale had said weeks ago, that Beatrice was not Mosepipal. And she thought about Caleb Marsh's wagon and Ruth wanting the recipe and Helen's frank assessment and the way Gideon had stood beside her after the bread was gone and said nothing and everything. She thought about the inventory chart on the third shelf, Clara's handwriting getting neater every version. She thought about Thomas's elbow healed now and the way he'd talked about trouble, the roan horse with Orrin yesterday, using vocabulary she hadn't taught him. She thought about Ida's asters on the windowsill, wilted now, and whether to replace them or let the windowsill be what it was until spring. She turned off the lamp and went to check on her children. Samuel's breathing was clear. The cough was done. He was sprawled across his half of the cot with the uncomplicated satisfaction of a child whose body has returned to working order and is making the most of the relief. Clara was asleep with a pencil in her hand. Evelyn took the pencil out carefully, the way she'd done at every place they'd slept over the last 6 weeks, except before it had been a floor or a pallet or the corner of a livery, and now it was a real bed in a real room, in a house that had an east-facing window and a pantry she'd organized herself. Thomas was not asleep. He was lying on his back, looking at the ceiling. She stopped in the doorway. "Go to sleep," she said quietly. "I know," he said, a pause. "Mama, I think we're staying," he said. Not a question, not quite a statement. More like a piece of understanding he was turning over in his hands, checking its weight. Evelyn looked at her oldest child in the dark of a room that was beginning slowly, carefully, without ceremony, to be theirs. "Go to sleep, Thomas," she said, but she didn't say he was wrong. Thomas was right. They were staying. But nobody said it out loud for another 3 weeks. That was the way of things at Cedar Run. Decisions got made in the space between what was said and what was done. And then one day you looked around and the decision had already been living there long enough to have dust on it, and naming it felt less like an announcement and more like catching up to something that had already moved on without you. November came in sideways. Cold that didn't ask permission, wind that found the gaps in the house's thinking and reminded everyone that Wyoming winters were not metaphorical. The hands started their days in darkness and ended them in darkness, and the middle hours of light were the color of old pewter. Evelyn added a second pot of coffee to the morning routine and started making 2 batches of biscuits instead of 1, because cold men eat more, and she had learned to read the ranch's hunger the way she'd learned to read the stove's temperament by paying attention until it became instinct. She also started making soup, not the survival soup of the first night, stretched from whatever the pantry held. Proper soup, with stock she'd started building from bones and vegetable ends, the way her mother had, slow simmered on the back of the stove, the kind of thing that filled the kitchen with a warmth that went beyond temperature. She made it in the big pot that had been hanging unused, on the far hook, the one all the hands had avoided cooking in, because it was the largest and the most work, and none of them had the patience for what it required. Dale came in one morning, poured his coffee, and stood at the stove, staring at the pot, with an expression she'd begun to recognize, the expression of a man remembering something he hadn't thought about in a while. "My mother made soup like that," he said. "What kind?" she asked. "Bean and ham, nothing special." He took a sip of his coffee. "She'd keep it going 3 days sometimes. Just kept adding to it. That's the right way," Evelyn said. He nodded and went out without saying anything else. But that evening at supper he ate 2 full bowls and didn't speak through either of them, which was the most honest review she could have asked out for. The ranch had settled into its winter rhythm by mid-November, and within that rhythm something else was settling too. The particular domestic geography of a household finding its arrangement. Thomas was at the stable every morning by 6:30 without being told. Orrin had stopped treating it as a favor and started treating it as expectation, which was its own form of respect. Clara had a dedicated corner of the kitchen table now, hers by unspoken agreement, where the ledger lived between uses and where her inventory charts existed in their current 4th iteration, which was considerably more sophisticated than the first had been. The twins had found their orbit. Ida helped Evelyn in the kitchen in the afternoons with the particular seriousness of a child who has decided that seriousness is her primary personality trait and is testing its limits. Samuel had attached himself to Dale with the inexplicable magnetic logic of 7-year-olds, and Dale, who had no children and had apparently been waiting, without knowing it, for someone to explain to, had accepted this arrangement with a gruffness that fooled nobody except possibly Samuel, who took it at face value and therefore found nothing intimidating about it. Gideon watched all of this. He didn't comment on it. He didn't arrange it or interfere with it. But Evelyn had become attuned to where his attention was, the way you become attuned to the particular sounds of a house you live in, and she knew he was watching. The way he watched Thomas at the stable fence. Not checking up on him, but watching him the way you watch something that surprises you by being good. The way he'd looked at Clara's 4th inventory chart for longer than was strictly necessary to read it. The way he'd listened, from the doorway she hadn't known he was occupying, to Samuel explaining to Dale with complete seriousness the exact process by which a caterpillar becomes a butterfly. Information Samuel had gotten from a book Ruth from the library, had pressed into his hands at a Sunday gathering, and which he had been distributing to every available adult ever since. Gideon had stood in that doorway for 4 minutes. She'd counted. What she couldn't fully read yet was what all of that watching was building toward. Whether it was simply the observation of a solitary man becoming less solitary, or whether it was something that had direction and weight and was headed somewhere specific. She didn't push at it. She'd learned that pushing at Gideon Rusk was like pushing at the gate she'd first arrived at. It looked solid, and it was solid, and force was not how you moved it. The letter from Beatrice Crowell arrived on a Thursday. It came through the general supply boy, tucked into the weekly delivery alongside the flour and the salt and the jar of molasses Evelyn had ordered, which meant Beatrice had either intercepted it herself or had someone watching the delivery manifest, both of which were possible, and neither of which Evelyn would have put past her. It was addressed to Gideon. Evelyn set it on his desk and said nothing about it. She found out what was in it 2 days later, not because Gideon told her, but because Dale told her, because Dale had been present when Gideon read it and had described his expression in the careful, non-editorial way of a man who is conveying information while technically not editorializing. He read it twice, Dale said. He was helping Evelyn carry supplies from the delivery cart, which he'd volunteered for with the energy of a man who wanted a reason to be near the kitchen. Set it down. Picked it back up. Set it down again. What did it say? Evelyn asked. I don't know exactly, Dale said. But after he read it, he came out to the fence and stood there for about 20 minutes looking at the north pasture. The north pasture was where he went to stand when something was bothering him. She knew that by now. He didn't say anything to you? She asked. He said the fence on the east line needed checking, Dale said, which it probably does. But that wasn't what he was thinking about. Evelyn carried the flour inside and put it on the correct shelf and stood in the pantry for a moment. Beatrice's letter, whatever it contained, had made Gideon stand at the north fence for 20 minutes. That was information. She went back to making lunch. Gideon came to her that evening. Later than usual, after the supper table had been cleared and the children were in their room, Thomas reading, Clara doing sums, the twins in the particular state of almost asleep that 7-year-olds inhabit where they're horizontal, but not quite gone. Sat at the table, and she put coffee in front of him without asking and sat down across from him, which was new. She'd been standing or working during most of their evening conversations, and sitting down felt like changing the terms of something. But she did it because something in his posture told her this wasn't going to be a short conversation, and she was tired from the day, and she was done pretending she wasn't. Put the letter on the table between them. She looked at it. You don't have to show me that, she said. I know, he said. I'm showing you anyway. She picked it up. Beatrice's handwriting was exactly what you'd expect controlled, even. The handwriting of someone who had practiced it until it looked effortless. The letter was 3 paragraphs. The first was pleasantries, the formal Wyoming Territory variety that function as runway before the actual landing. The second was concern, carefully worded, about the propriety of the arrangement at Cedar Run, the optics, as Beatrice put it, of a single man living on a ranch with an unmarried woman and 4 children. She used the word reputation twice. The third paragraph was an offer. Beatrice was proposing to supply Cedar Run with the proper housekeeper, a woman of established standing in Dry Willow, to replace what she called the current arrangement. She framed it as a generous gesture. She framed everything as a generous gesture. Evelyn set the letter down. When did you get this? She said. Thursday. And you waited until tonight to show me. I needed to think about it first, he said. What was there to think about? She said. The question came out flatter than she intended. She took a breath and tried again. You're not going to take this offer. No, he said. I'm not. Then what are we talking about? He looked at the letter on the table between them. We're talking about the fact that she's not wrong about the optics, he said. I've been telling myself she doesn't have a point, but she has a point. Not the point she thinks she has, but he picked up the coffee and set it back down without drinking from it. People are going to talk. They're already talking. And I need to know that you understand what you're staying in the middle of by being here. Evelyn looked at him. She understood what he was doing. He was giving her an exit with dignity, framing the conversation as information sharing when what it actually was a door held open in case she wanted it. "I walked 3 miles to this gate with 32 cents and 4 children," she said, "and I negotiated terms before I unpacked. I'm not someone who makes decisions without knowing what she's walking into." "That was different," he said. "How?" "You were desperate then," he said. Bluntly, the way he said hard things, not to wound, but because he'd decided long ago that the clean version of a hard thing was kinder than the wrapped version. She held his gaze. "I'm not desperate now," she said. "I'm here because I chose to be here." "That's different." "I know," he said, "but Beatrice isn't going to let this alone. She has influence in Dry Willow, and she's not used to being on the wrong side of a public moment." "No," Evelyn agreed. "She's not. Which means she's going to keep finding angles." "Yes," Evelyn said. He looked at her. "Does that bother you?" he asked. She thought about it honestly. The way she'd been trying to think about everything since she arrived here. Without the filter of desperation that makes things look better than they are, because you need them to be. "It bothers me that my children are inside it," she said. "If it were just me, I'd manage Beatrice Crowell without a second thought. But Thomas knows something is going on, and he's old enough to be affected by it, and Clara is 9, and already reading people the way she reads ledgers, and I don't want this," she gestured, "not at anything specific to be something they carry." Gideon was quiet for a long time. "What would make it easier for them?" he asked. It was such a direct question that she wasn't prepared for it. She opened her mouth, closed it. "Clarity," she said finally. "They need to know where they stand. Children can manage almost anything if they know where the ground is." Gideon looked at the table, at the letter, then away, at the middle distance that was his thinking posture. He stopped. "Differently. I told you when you arrived that I hired a cook. That's true. That's what the arrangement is. But that's not," he was choosing words with unusual care, which for a man who already chose words carefully meant he was in territory he hadn't fully mapped. "That's not the whole of what's happened here." Evelyn waited. "My wife died, and I let this ranch go to pieces inside," he said. "Not the cattle side. The rest of it. The part that makes a working ranch something other than a cattle operation. And you came here and you didn't. You weren't asked to fix that. But you fixed it anyway, because that's apparently what you do when you see something broken and you have the means to address it." "I fixed the pantry," Evelyn said carefully, "and the accounts." "You fixed more than the pantry," he said. She didn't argue with him. She knew it was true. She just needed to hear what he was building toward before she responded to it. "I don't want you to leave," he said. He said it flat and without decoration, the way he said everything that mattered to him. Not because of the ranch, because of he stopped. "Because you changed what it felt like to be in this house, and I don't know what I'd do with it going back to what it was." Kitchen was very quiet. Outside, the wind moved against the house, and the fire in the stove settled. "Gideon," she said. "I know it's not simple," he said quickly. "I know there's your children, and there's what Beatrice is going to do, and there's the fact that this started as a job, and I'm aware that's a complicated thing too." He cut himself off. "I'm not asking for anything tonight. I just needed you to know that." Evelyn looked at him. She looked at the man who had stood at the south gate, with his arms crossed and doubt on his face, and had agreed to a supper as a test, and who had come to the table 6 days into a job instead of 15, and who had stood in the Dry Willow Square and said things that cost him something, with the people whose money and standing he couldn't easily afford to lose, and who had spent 20 minutes at the north fence after reading a letter because it needed thinking about. She looked at him and thought about what she actually felt, stripped of obligation and gratitude and the complicated debt of having been helped by someone. What she actually felt when he walked into the kitchen in the morning, what it was like to hand him coffee without asking and have him take it, without pretending he needed to be invited, what the quality of an evening was when he was the last one at the table, and they talked about the week's or Clara's chart, or nothing in particular. She did not say any of that. Not yet. Not tonight. Because she had learned, expensively, that the first version of an honest feeling is not always the right moment for it, and because she needed to know that what she said next came from the steadiest part of herself, and not from the part that had been frightened and grateful and tired for a very long time. "I know," she said. 2 words. But she said them in a way that meant she had received what he'd said and received it completely and was not dismissing it and was not ready to answer it yet, and that all of those things were true simultaneously. He nodded. He picked up the letter and folded it and put it in his breast pocket, which meant he was putting it away and not acting on it, which was its own answer to Beatrice. "I'll write to her tomorrow," he said. "Keep it short," Evelyn said. Something crossed his face that was close to a smile. The same, not quite a smile she'd seen a few times before, the ones that appeared and disappeared before they fully formed. "Yes," he said. "Short." He took his coffee and went to his room, and Evelyn sat at the work table alone in the kitchen for a while, listening to the fire and the wind, and let herself think about it. Clara found her there 20 minutes later. This was not unprecedented. Most of its windows were dark. Clara sometimes appeared in the kitchen in the evening under the pretense of needing water or a second blanket, but actually because she was a 9-year-old who paid attention to everything, and sometimes the weight of it kept her from sleeping. She climbed into the chair across from Evelyn and sat with her legs folded under her in the way she did when she was settling in for something, rather than passing through. "Everything all right?" "Yes," Evelyn said. Clara looked at her with the particular expression of a child who has learned that adults say yes to that question as a default regardless of accuracy. "Are you sure?" Clara said. "I'm thinking," Evelyn said. "There's a difference." Clara accepted this. She sat quietly for a moment, which was unusual enough that Evelyn looked at her. "Mama," Clara said. Do you like it here?" Evelyn looked at her daughter, 9 years old, with her father's dark eyes and the evaluating expression that she'd come into the world with, as though she'd arrived already in the middle of an analysis she hadn't finished. "I do," Evelyn said. "More than the other places?" "Much more." "Because of the kitchen?" Clara asked. She meant it as a real question. She was trying to understand the variable. "Partly," Evelyn said. "Because of Miss Rusk?" Clara said, with the same tone she used for everything. Not pointed, just direct, because she hadn't yet learned the social convention of making certain questions sound like something other than what they were. Evelyn looked at her daughter for a long moment. "Get to bed, Clara," she said. Clara unfolded her legs from the chair, stood up, started for the door. "Clara," Evelyn said. She stopped. "Don't discuss this with Thomas," Evelyn said. "I already did," Clara said. "Last week. He thinks you're going to marry Mr. Rusk." Evelyn stared at her. "He's 11, she said. "He's observant," Clara said, without apology, and went back to bed. Evelyn sat alone in the kitchen and put her face in her hands for a moment, not from distress, but from the pure, exasperated affection of a mother whose children were paying more attention than she'd accounted for. Then she took her hands away and looked at the work table and the fire and the organized shelves and the fourth inventory chart pinned neatly to the beam where it could be read from anywhere in the kitchen. She thought about the morning she'd mixed biscuit dough while her children slept in one room of a house that wasn't hers. She thought about 32 cents in her coat pocket. She thought about what it felt like to need somewhere so badly that you negotiated terms you weren't sure you could meet, not out of confidence, but out of the refusal to show the alternative. And she thought about what it felt like now. Standing in this kitchen, knowing where every jar was, knowing how the stove ran, knowing which hands would be hungry, still after a second serving, and which ones were done after one. Knowing the sound of this house at night, which boards shifted, which window rattled in north wind, which direction the draft came from. Knowing, without looking, exactly which chair Gideon Rusk would sit in when he came to the kitchen in the evening, because it was always the same one, and knowing that was now as ordinary and unremarkable as knowing where the flower lived. She got up and banked the fire for the night. 3 days after Gideon's letter went out to Beatrice, the next thing happened, which was also what Evelyn had expected the next thing to be, because she knew enough about women like Beatrice Crowell to know that being written off in 2 sentences was not an ending, it was provocation. Beatrice came to Cedar Run a second time, but she didn't come alone. She came with 2 women from Dry Willow's informal social authority, the kind of authority that has no title but enormous weight in a small community. Mrs. Frances Aldrich, whose husband owned the mill, and Mrs. Dorothy Vane, whose family had been in the territory before most of the current residents had arrived. Both women were in their 50s. Both had the settled presence of women who are used to their opinion being taken seriously, and both arrived at Cedar Run in Beatrice's carriage, with the specific energy of people who believe they are performing a service. Evelyn saw them coming from the kitchen window. She went to find Gideon. He was in the office, which meant he'd been doing accounts, which meant Clara's chart was on the desk. She told him in 2 sentences who was in the carriage, and he stood up and put on his coat, and she said, "Don't manage it." He looked at her. "I told you before," she said. "My way. My time." "Beatrice brought reinforcements," he said. "I can see that." "Francis Aldrich's husband holds notes on 2 neighboring ranches," he said. "She's not she matters, Evelyn. What she says about Cedar Run matters." "I know," Evelyn said. "Let me handle it." He looked at her for a long moment. "You're going to serve them tea," he said. It wasn't a question. He'd already understood the approach from something in her posture. "I'm going to serve them tea," she confirmed. And let them see what they came to see," she said, "which is this kitchen, and this household, and these children, and whatever they decide about all of it is what they decide." "That's not a strategy," he said. "It's the only one that works," she said, "because there's nothing here to hide. So I'm not going to hide it." She went back to the kitchen and put the kettle on. Beatrice brought them in with the manner of a woman who owned the moment, but the moment resisted. Most of its windows were dark. What the 2 women from Dry Willow saw when they walked into the kitchen was not the improvised, inadequate domestic arrangement they'd been primed to expect. What they saw was a kitchen running the way kitchens are supposed to run. Clean, warm smelling of the noon soup, still sitting on the back of the stove. Clara at the corner table with the ledger, who looked up and said, "Good afternoon," with such composed politeness that Francis Aldrich blinked. The twins visible through the window in the yard, playing some complicated game involving a rope and a fence posts that made no obvious sense, but was being conducted at an appropriate volume. Thomas was not present, which meant he was at the stable, which was where he was supposed to be. Evelyn set tea on the table and gestured to chairs with the same ease she'd have shown them in any kitchen she'd been running for a year, which she supposed this one now was. "Mrs. Aldrich," she said. "Mrs. Vane. It's nice to meet you both." Francis Aldrich looked around the kitchen, then at Evelyn, then at Clara, then at the 4th inventory chart on the beam. "Is that the household inventory?" she asked, directly. The question of a woman accustomed to running things. "My daughter keeps it," Evelyn said. "It helps us manage the supply schedule without running short mid-week." "Your 9-year-old," Beatrice said. The clarification was intended to make it sound implausible. "She'll be 10 in March," Evelyn said, same as she'd said to Gideon. "She's good with numbers." Francis Aldrich was looking at the chart with what appeared to be genuine interest. "My housekeeper keeps a similar system," she said. "She had to develop it herself over 10 years. Your daughter developed this in how long?" "About 3 weeks," Evelyn said. Dorothy Vane, who had been quiet since arriving and had the look of a woman who gathered information before deploying it, said, "How old are your children?" "Thomas is 11. Clara will be 10 in March. The twins Samuel and Ida are 7. And they've been with you through all of this?" Dorothy said. "The traveling, the difficulty." "They've been with me through everything," Evelyn said. "Yes." Dorothy looked at her steadily. "That must have been hard." "It was," Evelyn said. She didn't dress it up. "But they're good children. They don't complain about things that can't be changed. They just adapt." There was a pause. Beatrice said smoothly, "It's a charming household. Very practical." She'd used that word before, same tone, same blade. Most of its windows were dark, but this time Francis Aldrich turned and looked at her with an expression that was not quite a frown and not quite a challenge, but was something in between. Dorothy said to Evelyn, without acknowledging Beatrice's comment, "You reorganized the pantry yourself." "In the first week," Evelyn said, "the kitchen hadn't been managed since," she chose words, "since Mr. Rusk's wife passed. The supplies weren't organized for the size of the household. I changed that." "And the accounts?" Dorothy said. She'd noticed Clara with the ledger. "I flagged an overpayment in the March seed order," Evelyn said. "Mr. Rusk recovered $14 from Hendrick's supply. Clara found it first and told me." Something happened between Dorothy and Francis. Not a look. It was more subtle than that. The micro-adjustment of 2 women who have known each other long enough to communicate without visible signals. Beatrice said, "I simply thought, given the optics of the situations." "Beatrice," Dorothy said mildly. Beatrice stopped. It was the mildness that did it. The particular mildness of someone whose authority is so established that they don't need volume. Dorothy turned back to Evelyn. Cedar Run has been running better this season, Dorothy said. My husband mentioned it. He trades cattle with Gideon. She looked at the kitchen. Clara. At the chart. At the pot on the back of the stove. Can see why. Beatrice's posture changed almost imperceptibly. The recalculation again, the same one Evelyn had seen at the harvest gathering, looking for a new position when the current one was no longer tenable. Francis Aldrich said, "Do you have plans to stay, or is this a temporary arrangement?" The question was neutral, genuinely seeking information, not setting a trap. Evelyn looked at her. I haven't been formally asked to stay permanently, she said. Was true, but I'm not planning to leave. Francis nodded slowly. The tea sat on the table, and the kitchen was warm, and Clara's pencil moved quietly in her corner, and outside, one of the twins was apparently explaining something to the other with great emphasis because the voice carried thin through the window. Beatrice made one more attempt. Of course, the question of propriety remains, she said. An unmarried woman, Beatrice, Francis said. Not mildly this time. Beatrice went quiet. Francis looked at Evelyn. Thank you for the tea, she said. This is a well-run household. Anyone can see that. Dorothy added, Please give Gideon our regards. They stood. They left. Beatrice left last, and she looked at Evelyn as she went through the kitchen door with an expression that had moved through all its stages and arrived. And finally, at something that was almost genuine, not respect exactly, but the recognition that comes when a person of intelligence encounters something they misjudged, and the intelligence wins over the pride enough to acknowledge it. She said nothing. She didn't need to. The door closed behind her. Evelyn stood in the kitchen. Clara said, without looking up from the ledger, Did that go well? Yes, Evelyn said. I thought so, Clara said. Mrs. Aldrich looked at the inventory chart for a long time. She did, Evelyn agreed. I should make the 5th version soon, Clara said. The columns for the monthly average aren't accurate yet. That can wait until tomorrow, Evelyn said. Go wash your hands. It's almost time to start the supper prep. Clara closed the ledger. She slid off the chair and straightened her skirt, which was one of 2 she owned and had been washed the night before, and she stopped at the kitchen door and said, Mama, when Mrs. Crowell said that word. Practical. Evelyn looked at her. I looked it up in Mr. Rusk's dictionary, Clara said. It means efficient and sensible in approach. I don't think she meant it as an insult. She did, Evelyn said. Oh, Clara said. That's strange. Those are good things. She went to wash her hands. Evelyn looked at the chair Clara had just vacated, at the ledger on the table, at the 4th inventory chart on the beam. She thought about a 9-year-old looking up the word practical in a dictionary to understand if she'd heard an insult. She thought, you don't get to choose what you pass on to your children. You just live as honestly as you can and hope that what they absorb is the part worth keeping. Gideon had been watching from the office doorway when the carriage left. He came to the kitchen 5 minutes later. He looked at the table where the tea had been, at the chairs still slightly pulled out, at Clara gone. Well, he said. Francis Aldrich says you have a well-run household, Evelyn said. He stood there. Dorothy Vane sends her regards, she added. And Beatrice, he said. She was quiet by the end, Evelyn said. He absorbed that. You knew they'd see it, he said. That's why you said let me handle it. I knew there was nothing to hide, she said. So I didn't hide anything. He looked at her with the particular stillness that she understood now, not distance, but the opposite. The way he went still when something mattered enough that motion felt careless. Evelyn, he said, the way he said her name. Not the tone of a man stating a fact. The tone of a man beginning a sentence he'd been composing for a while. She looked at him. I meant what I said the other night, he said, about not wanting you to leave. I know, she said. Same as before. I want to be clear about what I mean when I say that, he said. Gideon, she said carefully. No, he said. Let me. He looked at the table, then back at her. I don't want you to stay because the ranch needs a cook. The ranch needed a cook in October, and I could have hired anyone, and I didn't because he stopped. What I feel toward you isn't something I've felt, since Martha, and I know how that sounds. Coming from a man who was married, and I know it's complicated. But I'd rather say it plainly and be wrong about it than not say it, and be right about that instead. Kitchen was very still. Evelyn stood at the work table with her hands resting on it and looked at this man. This difficult, quiet, Honest man who stood in doorways and looked at north pastures and said hard things plainly, because he decided at some point that plainness was the only thing worth bothering with, and she thought about what she'd told. Herself she needed before she answered this question. She'd said she needed to know it came from the steadiest part of herself. She checked. It did. I know it's complicated, she said. I know what I am and what I came here with and how that looks from the outside. I know Beatrice Crowell is going to keep finding angles. She paused. And I know that somewhere between the first supper and that harvest table and sitting in this kitchen in the evenings, I stopped thinking about this place as temporary. He held very still. But I need something from you, she said. What, he said. I need this to be, she chose the word carefully, clear to me. Not an arrangement that's understood but not named. Not something that operates in the space between what's said and what's done. She looked at him steadily. My children need ground to stand on. So do I. Then let me give you ground, he said. He wasn't talking about the conversation anymore. She could hear it in his voice, the shift from the tentative territory of what he felt to the more familiar territory of what he could do about it. Gideon Rusk, she had learned, was not a man who sat in uncertainty if action was available. The uncertainty made him stand at north fences. The action made him look like himself again. Not tonight, she said. I mean it, Gideon. Not because I'm saying no. Because I'm saying. She took a breath. When you ask me something like that, I want to be able to answer it without feeling like I'm still counting my options. And I'm not there yet. Not quite. He looked at her for a long time. All right, he said. The same word he used for everything that was solid. All right, she said. He went back to the office, and Evelyn started the supper prep. And outside the twins came in from the yard with cold, reddened faces. And the news that Samuel had figured out how to make the rope game work with 3 people if Ida was willing to be a fence post, which Ida was not, and they both needed to be told to wash before supper. Some evenings at Cedar Run, the ordinary ran right alongside the extraordinary, and you couldn't tell where one ended and the other began. This was one of those evenings. The snow came on a Tuesday, which nobody had predicted, which was the first sign that this particular winter intended to make its own schedule regardless of what anyone had planned around it. Evelyn woke to a silence so complete she knew before she opened her eyes. There is a specific quality to the silence of heavy snowfall. Not the absence of sound, but the presence of something that absorbs it, a blanketing that changes the acoustic character of the whole world outside the walls. She lay still for 3 seconds, then got up. The window in the east-facing room showed her what she already knew. White from the ridge line to the fence posts, from the stable roof to the yard gate, and still coming down with the unhurried commitment of weather that has decided to stay, not a dusting. Not the polite early-season snow that arrives and apologizes and melts by afternoon. This was the kind of snow that meant the supply road would be gone by noon, and the question of what was in the pantry had just become considerably more urgent than it had been yesterday. She dressed fast and went to the kitchen. Clara's 5th inventory chart was on the beam where the 4th had been. Updated 3 days ago with the monthly averages, Clara had decided weren't accurate yet in version 4. Evelyn read it in 60 seconds, running the numbers in her head the way her daughter ran them on paper. Flour sufficient for 3 weeks at current rate. Dried beans, 2 weeks, maybe 2.5, if she stretched the ratio on the soup. Salt pork, adequate. Cornmeal, she needed to recount the cornmeal because the last entry didn't match what she remembered seeing on the shelf. She went to the pantry and counted the cornmeal. The chart was right, and her memory was wrong, which was slightly alarming in the abstract, but mostly just useful information. She made a note on the edge of the chart with the pencil. Clara kept tied to the beam with a piece of twine. Gideon appeared in the doorway at 5:15. You've seen it, he said. I've seen it, she said. Supply road will be under by mid-morning, he said. Maybe sooner if the wind picks up. I know. She was already at the work table, recalculating the week's meals against what she now knew with certainty was in the pantry. How long do your winters usually run like this? Depends, he said. He came into the kitchen and stood at the stove, not for the coffee, it wasn't ready yet, but for the heat, which meant he'd been outside already checking the livestock before he'd come inside, which meant he'd been up even earlier than her. Could be 3 days, could be 3 weeks. 47 was bad enough that some ranches didn't see the supply road clear until February. February, she said. We're not in 47, he said. I'm not saying, I know what you're saying, she said. I'm calculating for the long version and hoping for the short one. She looked up from the chart. The cornmeal is the weakest point. Everything else I can stretch. How? Soup base goes further when you start it with bones and let it reduce before you add anything else to it. Bread every day, but smaller portions. Men don't notice if you make the loaves a little shorter, as long as there's enough for everyone. Beans 3 times a week instead of 2. She paused. And I need to know how many of the hands are planning to stay on the property through the worst of it versus riding out to their own situations. Most of them stay, he said. They don't have situations to ride out to. That's why they're hands. There was no self-pity in the way he said it. Most of its windows were dark, just the matter-of-fact geography of men who make their lives on working ranches because they don't have other anchors, and the particular loneliness of that which Evelyn had never fully considered before, and which settled on her now with a different weight than it might have before she'd spent 2 months feeding these specific men 3 times a day and learning. Which ones were funny when they were tired, and which ones went quiet when they were worried. Then I'll plan for 14, she said. And us, he said. She looked at him. And us, she agreed. He nodded, poured the coffee that had just finished, took his cup to the doorway, looked out at the snow. Wake Thomas early, he said. Orrin's going to need help getting the feed out before it gets worse. I'll wake him now, she said. She did. And Thomas, who had been sleeping with the deep unconsciousness of a boy who had spent the previous day doing real physical work, surfaced from it with a speed that would have surprised her 6 months ago, and no longer did. He was dressed and out the door in 8 minutes. She heard him greet Orrin in the yard, heard Orrin say something she couldn't make out, heard Thomas laugh a short, real laugh, the kind that happens when 2 people have spent enough time together to have private jokes, and then the stable door, and then silence again under the snow. She started the bread. By the end of the first week of heavy snow, Cedar Run had found its winter rhythm. Harder and slower than the autumn rhythm, with more friction in everything, but it held. The hands rotated duties, so no one was outside in the worst of it for too long. Orrin had instituted what he called the buddy system for any work outside the main buildings, which meant Thomas was now's official buddy, a designation Samuel had briefly attempted to contest, on the grounds that he was also a person and therefore available, and which had been resolved through a negotiation that Evelyn had wisely not participated in. The kitchen was the center of the house, in a way it hadn't been even before. When there was nowhere else to be, and the weather made outside hostile, people gravitates toward warmth, and warmth was what the kitchen had most of. The hands came in earlier from the cold, and left later from the table. Conversations that had been 3 sentences long became 8. Dale taught Samuel a card game of dubious educational value that he called learning arithmetic. Orrin brought a piece of leather he'd been meaning to repair for months, and worked on it at the table end, while Thomas watched and occasionally handed him the wrong tool and was corrected with patient specificity. Clara continued with the ledger. About 2 weeks into the sustained snow, she came to Evelyn with the ledger open and said, with no preamble, mister, Rusk is going to lose money on the spring cattle sale if the calculation for the feed cost overrun isn't adjusted in the ledger before January. Evelyn looked at what Clara was pointing at. Show me, she said. Clara showed her. It was not a simple error, and it was not one that Evelyn would have caught easily without the chart, because it existed across 3 different entry points in the ledger and only became visible when you looked at all 3 together. The kind of thing that was entirely possible to miss when you were managing a ranch alone and using the same brain for cattle decisions and weather decisions and supply decisions and financial decisions and the particular grief that makes all of those things harder than they need to be. You need to show this to Gideon, Evelyn said. I thought you should see it first, Clara said. I've seen it, Evelyn said. Now show him. Clara looked at her. He's not going to be upset, she said. He's going to be grateful, Evelyn said. And if he's not, then he's wrong, and we'll discuss it after. Clara took the ledger to Gideon's office and knocked something. Evelyn had impressed upon her children from the first week as non-negotiable, and Evelyn heard Gideon say, "Come in." And then there was a long silence, during which she assumed Clara was explaining, which Clara did the way she did everything, methodically, sequentially, and without editorializing. Then she heard Gideon say something she couldn't make out. Then Clara came back to the kitchen. Was he grateful? Evelyn said. He said, well done, Clara said. That's the same thing, Evelyn said. Clara considered this. He also said he was going to need to go through the rest of the ledger this weekend with someone who can catch what he's missed. She said it neutrally. But she was 10 years old in a kitchen with her mother, and there was a particular quality to her neutral that always telegraphed more than she intended. I'll help him, Evelyn said. I could help him, Clara said, still neutral. Evelyn looked at her daughter. We'll see, she said. She did end up sitting with Gideon over the ledger. That Saturday evening, Clara on the other side of her doing the inventory chart update she claimed to be doing, but was clearly also monitoring the ledger work from her peripheral vision. They found 2 more entries that needed adjustment, neither as significant as the feed cost issue, but real. Gideon made the corrections in his own handwriting, which was larger and more angular than Clara's careful columns, and he said almost nothing while they worked. But he said it in the specific way that meant he was concentrating rather than absent. When they were done, he closed the ledger and sat back. How much did she catch that I missed? He said. He was asking Evelyn, but he said it loudly enough that Clara could hear. Everything significant, Evelyn said. He looked at Clara. Thank you, he said. Clara looked up from the inventory chart. You should have someone review it monthly, she said. The errors compound if they sit. Gideon looked at her with the expression he'd been developing over the months, which was something between the flat assessment he gave most things and something warmer that he hadn't found a posture for yet. Is that a proposal? I think so, she said. Then yes, he said, monthly. Clara went back to her chart. Gideon looked at Evelyn. Evelyn looked at the ledger between them and then at her daughter, and felt the particular feeling that is not pride exactly, but is adjacent to it, the feeling of watching a person you made become themselves. And finding out they are something you couldn't have planned. Most of its windows were dark. The snow let up briefly in the 3rd week, and then came back harder, and it was in the 2nd wave that the news came through about the Hendricks family on the North Road. Dale brought it in from a neighbor who'd come through on horseback, a man named Carson whose own property was 2 miles east. He told it to Gideon at the stable, and Gideon told Evelyn that evening. The Hendricks had 3 children under 10 and a fourth on the way. Their supply had run badly short before the 2nd wave hit, and they were now isolated with what Carson estimated was less than a week's provisions. And the road between their property and Dry Willow's general store was not passable. Gideon said all of this standing in the kitchen doorway. Evelyn was already at the pantry before he finished the sentence. Evelyn, he said. Give me 10 minutes, she said. I wasn't saying no, he said. I was going to say I can get 2 of the hands to take a horse and carry what you pack. She came out of the pantry. You'll need to take the sled, not just the horse. If she's far enough along, she won't be able to move supplies from a horse's saddlebags by herself. I know, he said. I was going to say that, too. She looked at him. He had the expression of a man who had already made the decision before he'd wanted to tell her, not to ask permission, but to plan together. But she had noticed the shift. She had noticed the shift when it started happening, somewhere around week 6. The change from Gideon, informing her of things, to Gideon telling her things, because her input changed the shape of the plan. She didn't comment on it. But she noticed they packed 2 crates. Evelyn did the math against the pantry the way she'd been doing it since the snow started, the careful, honest accounting of what could go without Cedar Run hitting its own edge, and then she took slightly more than that, because she knew her own math was conservative by nature, and she could pull the difference back through economy in the next 10 days. Flour, cornmeal, dried beans, salt pork, the portion that had been cured longer and would travel without issue, a jar of the soup base she'd been maintaining on the back of the stove, which she poured into a sealed container and wrapped in cloth to hold the heat as long as possible. Dried apple. Sugar, not much but some, because a woman carrying a child in a cold house needed something that wasn't strictly practical every so often. She packed it with the same care she packed everything, which was not ceremonial care but functional care things, positioned so they wouldn't shift and break in transit. The heaviest at the bottom, the fragile things cushioned. Dale and a hand named Pete took the sled out at first light. They came back 4 hours later. Dale came into the kitchen and said, without prompting, she cried when she saw the soup. Evelyn turned back to the stove. She's all right? She asked. She's all right, Dale said. She's tough. But he paused, searching for how to say it. She was scared. You could see it on her. And then she wasn't. Evelyn nodded. There's coffee, she said. Sit down. Sat down. She poured. Neither of them said anything for a moment, and it was the kind of quiet that doesn't need filling. Gideon came to her 3 days after that. Not in the evening, not with the gradual approach of a man working up to something. In the middle of the afternoon, direct, the way he was when he'd made a decision and was done sitting with it. She was at the work table, and he came through the kitchen door and closed it behind him and stood on his side of the table. I went to see Caleb Marsh last week, he said, before the second snow. She remembered he'd mentioned riding east. She'd thought it was about the cattle. His wife is recovering, he said slowly. But she's up now. She asked about you. She doesn't know me, Evelyn said. She knows what came in that basket, he said. In her position, that's enough. He put his hands flat on the table, the posture she'd seen dozens of times, the one that meant he was settling in for something rather than passing through. I also rode north to see the Aldrich property, on business. Frances Aldrich asked about you again. What did she want to know? She wanted to know if you were staying, he said. I told her I was working on it. Evelyn looked at him. You told Frances Aldrich you were working on it, she said. I told her what was true, he said. I've been working on it. She set down what she was holding. He reached into his coat and put an envelope on the table between them. She looked at it, then at him. Open it, he said. She did. It was a document. 2 pages, handwritten on the legal paper that the Dry Willow Land Office used, which she recognized because she'd seen it once before, when her husband had signed a property agreement and the paper had that specific weight and texture. She read the first paragraph. Then she read it again. It was a partnership agreement, not an employment contract, not an informal arrangement, not an understanding that existed in the space between what was said and what was done. A formal legal document establishing Evelyn Ruth Mercer as managing partner of Cedar Run Ranch's household operations, with authority over all domestic decisions, supply procurement, financial review of household accounts, and a 20% share of the ranch's annual net income derived from operations she managed directly. She looked up. Gideon, she said. Before you say anything, he said, I had Aldrich's lawyer draw it. Not because I don't trust you, because I want you to have something that isn't dependent on trusting me. Something that's yours regardless of, he paused. Regardless of what happens or doesn't happen between us personally. If you sign this and decide next year you want to leave, you leave with what you built here. It doesn't disappear. She looked at the document. She didn't have the right word for it immediately, which was unusual. It's what you earned, he said. And it's what I should have offered in October instead of $12 a month, and a maybe. She looked at the second page. Her name, in print formal, with a line for her signature, and beside it for the first time in any document she'd ever been attached to. A column of numbers that represented not what someone was willing to give her, but what she had actually contributed to something she'd helped build. There's something else, he said. She looked up. He was looking at her with the expression she'd cataloged over months, not the blank assessment of the first day, not the careful distance of the first weeks, not the gradual opening of the middle months. This was the unguarded version, the one that appeared in the evenings at the table sometimes, briefly, when he forgot to monitor it. Except now he wasn't forgetting. He was choosing it. I told you I wasn't going to ask you something until you were ready, he said, and I meant that. I'm not asking you now if you're not. But I need you to tell me where you are, because I've been carrying this for long enough that I'm not sure I can keep calibrating against a maybe. She looked at this man. Difficult and honest and imperfect and standing on the other side of a table she'd set 1,000 times over 2 months in a kitchen that smelled like soup and bread and that smelled like soup and wood smoke scent of a house that was being lived in. She thought about 32 cents. She thought about the gate. She thought about choosing a future instead of surviving another day. The document first, she said. He nodded. She reached for the pen on the table edge. She signed it. He signed it on his line. Beneath hers, most of its windows were dark, and she noticed that his signature was steadier than she'd have expected from a man who had just watched something important happen, which told her he'd been more certain of this outcome than he'd let on. She set the pen down. Now, she said, he looked at her. Ask me, she said. He came around the table. He did not make a speech. He was not a man who made speeches, and she would not have wanted one. He said, Evelyn, will you marry me? Not a question exactly. More like a statement that required confirmation, which was exactly the right register for who he was and who she was and what they'd been building in this kitchen since October. She said yes. One word, same as his deal, same as his all right. No decoration, just solid. He reached out and took her hand, and she let him, and that was the whole ceremony of the moment, her hand in his. Across the work table of the kitchen they'd been sharing for 2 months. Partnership document between them, with both their signatures on it, the fire in the stove, the 5th inventory chart on the beam, the soup on the back burner. Then she said, you have to tell the children. I thought you'd tell them, he said. Thomas has known for weeks, she said. Clara thinks she's been subtle about monitoring it. The twins will ask what it means, and you'll need to explain it, and I want to see how you do. He looked at her. You're enjoying this, he said. A little, she admitted. She had not, in fact, been wrong about Thomas. When Gideon told them at supper that evening, simply, directly, the way he did everything, without preamble or theatrical announcement, Thomas nodded once in the way of a boy who has been waiting for information he already had to become official. Clara said, Are we going to change our name? Gideon looked at her, then at Evelyn, then back at Clara. That's your choice, he said. All 4 of you. Any of you. Whenever you want to, or not at all. Clara considered this with her evaluating expression. Think about it, she said. Samuel said, What does it mean? It means we're family, Gideon said. It means Cedar Run is your home. Samuel processed this. It's already my home, he said, with the uncomplicated certainty a 7-year-old for whom this had evidently been settled for some time. Ida, who had been watching Gideon's face through the whole conversation with the serious assessment she applied to most things, said, Do you know how to braid hair? Gideon paused. No, he said. Mama does it wrong sometimes, Ida said. She pulls, I do not pull, Evelyn said. You pulled last Tuesday, Ida said. That was a knot. It was a pull, Isa said, with the serenity of someone who has decided the matter. Dale, at the far end of the table, made a sound into his coffee that was not quite a laugh and did not fully succeed at being anything else. Orrin looked at the ceiling. Thomas said, quietly, to nobody in particular, It's about time. Evelyn looked at her oldest child. Thomas, she said. I've been thinking it since November, he said, without apology. And the table 14 ranch hands, and a widow, and her 4 children, and a rancher who had spent 8 months letting his house go cold became loud with the ordinary noise of people who are against the odds, and through considerable difficulty, actually comfortable with one another, and that noise filled the kitchen and went all the way to the ceiling and was probably the best thing Cedar Run had sounded like in years. They were married in March on a Thursday, because Evelyn said she saw no reason to wait for a Saturday if Thursday was available, and Gideon had agreed this was reasonable. Ruth from the library witnessed it, along with Dale, who cried and denied it to everyone, including himself, and Frances Aldrich, who came because she wanted to and because Evelyn had, over the winter months, developed something with Frances that was close to genuine friendship than she'd expected, built through direct conversation and shared opinions about household management and the occasional exchange of information that 2 competent women find useful when they stop performing for each other. Clara wore her good dress and brought the inventory chart because she said she'd been updating it that morning and hadn't wanted to leave it mid-entry, which Evelyn chose to interpret as nervousness expressed in the language available to a 10-year-old who doesn't acknowledge nervousness. Thomas shook Gideon's hand after, which was his version of the hug he wasn't ready to give yet, and Gideon shook serious gravity of a man receiving exactly the thing being offered and not asking for more. The twins had been told there would be cake. There was cake. Evelyn had made it herself, which made it both the wedding cake and, technically, the gift she gave herself, which Ruth said was the most sensible wedding decision she'd ever witnessed. Beatrice Crowell was not there. She had not been there for most things over the winter. After Frances Aldrich and Dorothy Vane had come to Cedar Run and left without the outcome she'd engineered for, after Gideon's 2-sentence letter, after the harvest gathering had redistributed the town's opinion in ways that couldn't be redistributed back, Beatrice had not disappeared from Dry Willow, because Beatrice was not the kind of woman who disappeared. But she had, over the course of the winter, stopped pressing. Evelyn didn't know if it was Francis's quiet authority, or Dorothy's mild one-word correction, or the gradual weight of public opinion settling in a direction Beatrice couldn't reverse, or simply the accumulated effect of a woman who had tried every available angle and found none of them produced the outcome she'd been counting on. Maybe all of it. Maybe something private that Evelyn would never know. What she knew was this: Beatrice ran her mercantile. Sepson seen. Cedar Run bought supplies through the general store where possible and through Beatrice's mercantile when necessary, and those transactions were civil and nothing more. When they crossed paths in town, Beatrice was polite. Evelyn was polite in return. Neither of them performed warmth they didn't have. That was enough. Life was full of people you'd been in conflict with, who you eventually had to share a town with, and the grace in that wasn't forgiveness exactly. It was the practical decision to stop spending energy on a battle that was already done. Spring came, as spring does in Wyoming, not all at once but in arguments with the winter, that the winter sometimes won briefly before losing the larger point. The supply road cleared in the second week of March, 3 days before the wedding, and the first delivery came through with the particular relief of a community that had been managing on what it had and was glad to have options again. Evelyn had used the last of the backup cornmeal the previous Friday. Most were dark, which meant she'd calculated the winter pantry to within 1 week's provisions. Not because she'd been trying to be precise, but because she'd been trying to be honest about what they had and what they needed. And precision turned out to be what honesty looked like when you were paying attention. Caleb Marsh rode in on the second day after the road cleared. His wife sent a jar of her own preserved fruit, the fruit she'd been putting up. Since she recovered, she'd done 6 jars in February, which was the activity of a woman getting back to herself. There was a note with it in handwriting Evelyn didn't know that said, "For the soup, and thank you." Evelyn put the jar on the second shelf next to her own. Spring cattle sale went better than projected, partly because the accounts had been corrected in November and December, and the cost calculations were now accurate, and partly because Gideon had made decisions over the winter based on better financial information than he'd had in the previous year. Clara presented a 1-page summary of the discrepancy between the projected revenue and the actual with her now signature column structure, and Gideon read it and said, "Well done," in the same tone he'd used in November, which Clara had apparently decided was a satisfactory response, because she went back to her work without comment. The east-facing room was still Evelyn's room and her children's room, though the configuration had shifted as the house settled into its new arrangement. Thomas had been given the small room off the stable, which had been a storage room, till Orrin had spent 2 January evenings quietly converting it into something livable, and Thomas had moved into it with the seriousness of someone who understood that he had been given something that would have been unimaginable 6 months ago and intended to be worthy of it. Gideon had not rushed any of the children's adjustments. This was, Evelyn thought, perhaps the most significant thing about him: the patience he extended to her children's timelines. He didn't engineer moments of connection. He didn't perform fatherhood in the way of a man who needs to be seen performing it. He just showed up, every day, consistently, in the specific and unflashy way that consistency actually works, which is to say slowly and without announcement. Ida started coming to find him when her hair needed braiding. This happened one morning in February when Evelyn was occupied with the breakfast, and Ida had come to the kitchen door with the brush, and the particular expression of a child who has assessed the available options and made a decision, and she'd looked at Gideon at the table and said, "Can you try?" He had tried. He was not good at it. Ida had stood still with the patience of a child who has decided that effort deserves respect even when the execution is imperfect. And Gideon had made something that was technically a braid in the loosest possible sense of the word, and Ida had examined it in the small mirror Evelyn kept on the kitchen shelf and said, "I'll show you how to make it tighter." She had showed him. He had gotten better, slowly, over the following weeks, in the way you get better at things when a 7-year-old is watching you with serious attention and telling you specifically what you're doing wrong. Samuels had stopped asking what things meant. This was in its own way the clearest signal. Samuel had spent the autumn asking what things meant because he'd needed the ground identified before he could stand on it. By February, he'd stopped asking because he no longer needed to. The ground was just there, and he was standing on it. In April, something happened that Evelyn had not anticipated. Beatrice Crowell came to Cedar Run for the third time. She came alone. No carriage, she rode which Evelyn had not expected, and which meant something she hadn't calculated. She came at a morning hour and tied her horse at the gate and knocked at the kitchen doors, the way someone knocks when they're not sure of their welcome. Evelyn opened it. Beatrice looked different, was not precisely the right word. She looked like the same woman stripped of the particular armor she'd been wearing every other time Evelyn had seen her. Not diminished, just without the architecture of performance that she usually occupied, so naturally it seemed structural. "I'd like to speak with you," Beatrice said. "If you're willing." Evelyn looked at her for a moment. Then she stepped back from the door. Beatrice came in. She sat at the table where she'd sat in October, in the same chair, and looked at the kitchen that was the same kitchen and was also entirely different. The fifth chart on the beam, the organized shelves, the wedding photograph that Ruth had arranged for, small and in a simple wood frame, on the shelf near the window where Ida's asters had been in autumn. "I owe you an apology," Beatrice said. Evelyn sat across from her and waited. I behaved badly," Beatrice said. She said it with the difficulty of someone for whom apology is a less practiced skill than everything else. The harvest gathering and before that. She stopped. Tried again. "I've had certain ideas about my own future for a long time. And when those ideas turned out to be wrong, I handled that poorly." "You handled it by trying to discredit me," Evelyn said. "Not unkindly. Just precisely, yes," Beatrice said. "That's what I did." Evelyn looked at this woman, who was by any measure capable and intelligent, and had built something real with her mercantile and her standing in Dry Willow, and who had chosen, when she felt threatened, to reach for cruelty because she had the tools for it, and they were faster than anything else. Evelyn understood that impulse. She didn't say so, but she understood it. "I'm not going to tell you it didn't matter," Evelyn said, "because it did. You made a difficult situation harder, and you did it deliberately. My children were inside that situation." Beatrice's jaw tightened slightly. "I know," she said, but Evelyn said, "I'm not interested in carrying it indefinitely." Beatrice looked at her. "We live in the same town," Evelyn said. "Our households probably need to do business with each other at some point, if they don't already. That's going to go better for both of us, if we're not at war." "I'm not asking you to pretend it didn't happen," Beatrice said.
She seemed to be locating the right word.
I'm asking for the possibility of starting differently." Evelyn considered her. The easy version of this moment was the one where she accepted the apology warmly, and they embraced the possibility of friendship, and everything was resolved with the kind of thoroughness that doesn't leave anything to be worked out later. She'd seen that version in stories. It always seemed to require that both people be better than they actually were. "We can start differently," Evelyn said slowly. Beatrice nodded. Slowly she agreed, and Beatrice, Evelyn said. She looked up. "Francis Aldrich told me," Evelyn said, "that you're the one who put the word out through the valley about the Hendricks family. When they were short in the second snow." Beatrice said nothing. "She said you organized the supply run before Gideon had a chance to," Evelyn said, "that you did it quietly." "Francis talks too much," Beatrice said. "She talks honestly," Evelyn said. "There's a difference." Pause. "I have a functioning mercantile," Beatrice said stiffly. "It's not difficult to move supplies when they're needed." "No," Evelyn said. "But you did it anyway." Beatrice looked at the table. "I'm not entirely without—" She stopped. "I made poor choices about how I pursued certain goals. That doesn't mean another stop." "I know," Evelyn said. She put the coffee on. "Not because it was required. Because it was what you did when someone was sitting at your table and trying, imperfectly, to be better than they'd been." Beatrice stayed an hour. They did not become friends that morning, but they became something. Two women in the same valley who had been on opposite sides of something and were choosing for practical and perhaps slightly more than practical reasons not to stay there. It was not a warm thing. It was honest, which was more durable. When Beatrice left, Evelyn stood in the kitchen for a moment. Clara appeared from the direction of the back room, where she'd clearly been doing the legwork she'd said she was going to do, but had also clearly been listening to the last 15 minutes of the conversation. That was generous, Clara said. It was practical, Evelyn said. Both things can be true, Clara said. Evelyn looked at her 10-year-old daughter, who had her father's eyes and her mother's stubbornness and a mind that ran faster than either of them had been able to at that age, and she thought, yes, both things can be true. I thought you were doing the ledger, Evelyn said. I finished it, Clara said. Then go find your sister. Her hair needs redoing, and Gideon made it too loose again this morning. Clara went. By the summer of that first married year, Cedar Run had its shape. Not a perfect shape. Shapes made by real things rarely are. They're irregular in the places where the work was hard and slightly worn, where things had been managed rather than solved, and patched in the spots where the original had given out. But it held. It held because it was built from what was actually there, rather than what they'd wished was there, and that makes a different kind of structure than the kind built from hope alone. The ranch hands, who had watched Evelyn walk in with 4 children and a canvas bag in October, had developed, by summer, the particular loyalty of people who eat well and are treated with consistency. Dale had stopped pretending Samuel wasn't his favorite person under 4 feet tall. Orrin had taught Thomas more about horses than most men learn in a decade of professional work. And Thomas had given back to Orrin the thing that older men in solitary work most need, which is someone young who thinks what they know matters. The neighboring ranches had, through the winter and spring, become something more than adjacent properties. The Hendricks family sent their oldest boy to help with the summer fence mending as thanks for the second snow supplies, and the boy turned out to be 14 and good with wire, and he and Thomas worked 3 weeks together without incident, which was its own kind of diplomacy. Caleb Marsh stopped by twice once with eggs from his recovered wife's chickens, and once with nothing thence except the apparent need to check on whether Cedar Run was still the kind of place he thought it was, which it was. Evelyn had not stopped making bread every day. This was, she thought, the most honest thing she could say about what she'd built here. Not that it was perfect. Not that everything had resolved cleanly or that the difficult parts had disappeared. Beatrice Crowell was still Beatrice Crowell. The winters would keep being hard. The supply road would close again. There would be years when the cattle market was bad, and years when the weather didn't cooperate, and years when something unexpected took out one of the margins she'd carefully built up. But every morning she made bread, and every morning it was enough, and every morning the kitchen was warm before the ranch woke up, and those things had stopped being survival a long time ago, and had become something else entirely. The texture of a life that was hers, chosen and returned to every single day. One evening in early June, Gideon came in from the north pasture later than usual, the long day light still hanging over the ridge, and he came into the kitchen and poured himself water from the pitcher and stood at the window looking out at the yard. Thomas was at the fence talking to Orrin about something that involved a great deal of hand gesturing. The twins were running a game that involved a rope and a fence post and rules that apparently shifted based on who was winning. Clara was on the porch with the ledger, because the evening light was better outside than in. Gideon stood at the window and looked at all of it. Evelyn was at the work table. She watched him watch them. "What are you thinking?" she said. He turned. "I'm thinking," he said, slowly, "that I spent a year and a half keeping this place alive and not knowing what for." He looked back out the window. "And now I know what for." She looked at her husband, this man she had negotiated with at a gate in October with 32 cents in her pocket, this man who stood in doorways and went to north fences and said hard things plainly and had gotten better at braiding hair. And she did not say anything poetic or grand, because that was not who either of them were. She said, "The fence on the east line still needs checking." He turned around. "I know," he said. "I was going to do it tomorrow." "I know you were," she said. They looked at each other. And then Gideon did something she'd seen only rarely. He smiled fully, without it disappearing before it formed, and it changed his face in the particular way that people's faces change when they stop bracing against something and just let themselves be where they are. She turned back to the bread. Side, one of the twins shouted something about the rules of the rope game, and the other one shouted back. And Thomas said something that made Orrin laugh, and Clara called in from the porch that she'd found another entry that needed looking at, and the kitchen was warm and the fire was steady, and Cedar Run was, in every way that mattered, exactly what they had made it. which was not the same as what it had been, and not what anyone had planned it to become, just what it was full, imperfect, real, and theirs.